to encourage the fulfilment of that potential.
We now move on to the next item of business, which is a statement by Keith Brown on the basing review. The Minister will take questions at the end of his statement. There should therefore be no interventions or interruptions, and I will allow a few seconds for the Minister to get into position. Keith Brown, Minister, you've got 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In the House of Commons yesterday, the Defence Secretary Philip Hammond made a statement on the basing of military forces, including in Scotland. The implications of that statement are serious and they are of direct relevance to the current responsibilities of this Parliament. The military's presence in our nation has highly significant social and economic impacts. That statement was, as the Deputy First Minister said yesterday, a betrayal of Scotland and her communities. I'll set out why that is the case and what the Scottish Government intends to do to continue to hold the UK Government to account for its decisions. The Scottish Government fully recognises and values the vital part that the armed forces and those who serve in them make to the life of our nation, and that contribution cannot be sustained in isolation. It must be supported by wider society. The Scottish Government's successful approach to making sure that happens was set out in the Our Commitments paper, which I launched at Edinburgh Castle last September. Yesterday's announcement came a long time, over 18 months, since the then Secretary of State for Defence, Liam Fox, made his initial announcement about military basing. The Scottish Government had worked hard to support the UK Government in that process and the process that led up to that announcement, and that included forging a cross-party consensus and submissions from all the main parties in the Scottish Parliament. When it came, Liam Fox's announcement included some severe disappointments, including, importantly, that RAF operations would cease at Lookers. On top of the previous announcement that the RAF would also be leaving Kinloss, that was a particularly heavy blow. At a stroke, the number of air bases in Scotland was cut from 3 to 1. That disappointment was somewhat mitigated by his commitment that, as part of the rebasing of army personnel from Germany, up to 7,000 additional troops would be coming here to Scotland. That commitment was made in the full knowledge that the UK's regular army would be reduced to 82,000 by 2020. Suggestions otherwise are a reinvention of history. Philip Hammond's betrayal of that promise is a disgrace. Following Liam Fox's announcement, we committed to working positively with the Ministry of Defence, local authorities and other partners to make the changes work as best they could for service personnel, their families and communities around Scotland. Officials from Scottish Government have engaged fully with the MOD and its Defence Infrastructure Organisation at every available opportunity. At ministerial level since July 2011, various ministers, including the First Minister, the Deputy First Minister and myself, have underscored that commitment by raising issues connecting with the basing review, both in writing and through meetings, a total of 18 times with UK ministers. We have also been supportive of the local communities involved, meeting with those affected in the aftermath of the announcement, and through officials keeping closely in touch with local authorities. The time that it has taken to work through this process has led to a great deal of uncertainty and anxiety in those communities affected around Scotland. But now at last the announcement has come, and it is again deeply disappointing given the work that we have put in to try to make this process work for Scotland. In place of a commitment that army numbers would rise significantly as troops are rebased from Germany, the up to 7,000 that Liam Fox talked of, we now have a commitment that total numbers of armed forces personnel will rise by only around 600 from the baseline at July 2011. That suggests that numbers, if these time commitments are delivered, will be just over 12,500 by 2020. But that ignores the fact that Scotland has already seen disproportionate cuts in our defence footprint, which has fallen by more than a third since 2000. By comparison, across the UK as a whole, the decline has been around a fifth. The increase that Philip Hammond announced yesterday only serves to replace a small part of the decline in the military footprint that we have seen in Scotland under successive UK governments. Liam Fox's announcement included that Scotland would become home to one of the 5 multi-role brigades. But Philip Hammond has downgraded the military commitment to Scotland. Now Scotland will be home not to one of the 5 multi-role brigades, but to one of 7 army hubs. We still need clarity from him and from the MOD on what the roles and functions will be of the elements that will now be located here. Also, there was no mention of his predecessor's commitment to explore the possibility of additional training estate in Scotland, which we actively work to support and which has been ditched by Philip Hammond. I've mentioned the overall military footprint and the impact of the announcement nationally in Scotland, but of course it's at a local level that these changes will really have an impact. I do welcome the complete about-turn that the UK Government has made in relation to RM Condor and Arbroath and the basing of the Royal Marines there. However, around much of the country there is little else to be genuinely pleased about. At Lookers, there has now been finally confirmed that army units will be based there to replace the RAF. The numbers, though not yet confirmed, will not reach the 1,300 which Liam Fox promised. Equally, Liam Fox talked of an army HQ at Lookers. That was absent again from Philip Hammond's statement, and questions remain about what, if anything, that will amount to. It's also a disappointment in Fife that there has been confirmation that no army units will be based at the current Royal Navy facility at Caledonia and Rosyth. In Edinburgh, we have confirmation that Dreghorn will remain, but Craigie Hall and at least partially Redford Barracks will close. We now also know that the Kirk Newton site on the outskirts of Edinburgh will not be developed. From our point of view, the MOD must work immediately and closely with us and with the City of Edinburgh Council to make sure that it's handled properly, including setting out again the numbers associated with the units that they have said will be based in the different locations. Similar questions, though, arise in other areas. At Forthside in Stirling, clarity is needed on the partial disposal of the Army site there, as the HQ of 51 Brigade is relocated. At Kinloss, we are led to believe that there will be some further small increase in the numbers there, though the fact is that will still not bring the Army presence there, welcome though that is, to anywhere near the levels of RAF personnel previously. Already in the statement, I have set out some of the unanswered questions that still remain around this announcement. And the fact that so many questions remain is in part due to the remarkable, I heard it described today as a bizarre fact, that the UK ministers have not made any contact with Scottish ministers in connection with the announcement. Now, this is despite the fact that an MOD minister, Mark Francois, found time to stroll on the esplanade at Edinburgh Castle yesterday to brief the media. We also understand, through local authorities have had some written communication, that this does not set out the numbers that are associated with the Army units that have been allocated to different locations, and that's a shocking omission at this stage. We also have no detail on timing and numbers in relation to changes for the other services beyond the Army. Those are also required, not just by us but by the local authorities, and that situation is quite frankly unacceptable. And of course, Presiding Officer, it does not need to be this way. I believe that this Parliament is more than capable of taking decisions about defence in the best interests of our people and our communities. And given the many years of draconian cuts to Scotland's defence footprint by both Labour and Tory governments, how can anyone disagree with this simple democratic proposition? Scotland already contributes a great deal to defence spending and could afford conventional forces of its own, like other nations of similar size. And the SNP has set out that with independence, Scottish Defence Forces would have 15,000 regular personnel and be supported by a £2.5 billion defence and security budget, a defence settlement designed to meet Scotland's needs and priorities. And just by way of comparison, in 2010, Finland spent £2.3 billion on defence and Denmark £2.8 billion. And no one, I think, suggests seriously for a minute that countries such as these do not take their defence seriously. In stark contrast, of course, to the approach of the UK, we would not be spending money on Trident, weapons of mass destruction on our shores. As things stand, that costs Scotland around £163 million each and every year. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, we will continue to support local authorities, communities and other partners. I am writing to them to offer our ongoing support, and I have just spoken to senior personnel in the Army to convince them that we will continue to provide that support in future. But the UK Government must now confirm the numbers that will be associated with each of the units that they have said will be located in different parts of the country. Alongside that, since September, we have been pressing the UK Government for baseline information to enable us and local partners to understand the economic impact of the changes, and we will continue to demand the release of that information immediately in order to allow us to work with local authorities, communities and other partners to develop an impact study to help us plan fully for, as well as to mitigate, the economic consequences of these UK Government decisions. Once again, Presiding Officer, Scotland has been let down by UK governments and their ill-thought-through and poorly handled decisions. At least some members of this chamber will remember debates when it was a Labour UK government whose proposals, at that time for regimental amalgamation, that were doing damage to Scotland's military heritage. Labour governments, as well as the current Westminster government, have presided over long-term decline in Scotland's military footprint. Democracy, Presiding Officer, is about having the ability to choose, and I believe the people of Scotland will choose to reverse this decline and vote yes in next year's referendum.
Members who wish to ask a question of the Minister should press the request to speak button now. Can I also point out at this stage that time is very, very tight. Mark Griffin, followed by Alex Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and also thank the Minister for advance notice of his statement. We have seen a disappointing reduction in the number of armed forces personnel coming to Scotland than was promised, and the Scottish Government are asking for clarity. What clarity then can the Scottish Government give on the future of the armed forces in an independent Scotland and the civilian jobs associated with it, since figures today show that as part of the UK, overall spending per head in Scotland is £1,197 higher than the rest of the UK. In John Swinney's leaked Scottish Government document on the future finances of an
Can we
independent
just keep
Scotland,
to the issues in the statement, as you've just heard read out? Issues in the statement. I don't want to hear about the leaked document. Issues in the statement.
Presiding Officer, in the statement, and I quote, it says, "I have made clear to the Defence Workstream that a much lower budget must be assumed." So, despite that public rhetoric, can the Minister give a categorical assurance that the budget for a Scottish Defence Force will not be subjected to the savage cuts being suggested by John Swinney in this leaked document? Why are the SNP saying one thing in public and another in private? Does the Scottish Government expect Special Forces personnel to automatically transfer to Scottish Armed Forces, since some have expressed reservations about the deployment, specialist training and promotion opportunities which will be available to them? If there is no significant transfer of Special Forces personnel to a Scottish Defence Force, how long does the Minister anticipate it would take to recruit and train a Special Forces unit, and how long would key assets like North Sea oil rigs be left vulnerable as a result?
Minister.
Just for the purposes of clarity, Presiding Officer, the statement I made was about the UK Government statement, and I was trying to deal with some of the complications and some of the implications of that. And if I could just go and say to the very first point...
Order. We'll not have shouting across the chamber, please. Minister.
The very first point that Mark Griffin made was about clarity, and I think things are starting to become quite clear, because very much as the questions that he just asked when he sought to try and provide a human shield for the Conservative cuts which are taking place, as Jim Murphy did this morning on the radio, things are becoming clear. The commitment now from the Labour Party, they will commit billions of pounds towards nuclear weapons rather than the equipment and the troop numbers that our defence forces need, is providing some clarity. And it used to be the case, the member may not remember, but in the 1980s there was a statement by somebody called Paul Weller who said it's the kidney machines that pay for rockets and guns. Well, in the year 2013, it's Labour and the Tories' bedroom tax is going to pay for nuclear bombs. That's the clarity that we're seeing now from the Labour Party. We are committed to providing £2.5 billion worth of expenditure. We're committed, as we've stated, £2.5 billion. I said that in the statement, towards Scottish Defence Forces, which is commensurate with other countries of that size. What is the Labour Party's commitment? Are they going to continue with the Conservative cuts, or are they going to reverse any of these?
Alex Johnson, followed by Roderick Campbell.
Can I begin by thanking the Minister for advance sight of his statement, and can I also take the opportunity to welcome the significant increase in troop numbers stationed north of the border that was announced yesterday. Having a well-equipped, highly trained and motivated army presence makes Scotland a safer place. However, the Minister cannot bemoan the number of troops coming to Scotland when the effect of a vote for separation in 2014 would be to see the British Army withdraw altogether. Of course, Angus Robertson tells us that Scotland's share of defence spending would be kept in defence, diametrically opposing the view of Annabel Ewing, for example, and others on his backbenches who have already committed it to welfare or any one of a dozen other fleeting priorities. The truth is that this government does not understand defence. Can I ask, Why on earth does this anti-combat government want more troops but doesn't want them ever to be deployed anywhere?
Order.
And above all, can I ask the Minister if he will commit to set out clearly, in detail, the facts and the costs associated with his government's defence policy?
Order. Minister, before you start, can I just remind all members that this is a serious subject. You know, many of our constituents are involved in this or harmed by this. So can I ask that the Chamber just calms itself down and let's deal with the serious issues that are at hand? Minister.
Thank you, President. So the last point that was made by Alec Johnson, I have already set out the level of finance that the SNP would attribute towards defence, and it's commensurate with other countries of our size. So I've answered that point. He started off by saying that he welcomed the announcement by the UK Government. It would be interesting to listen in barrack rooms around the country to see what squaddies are saying about the announcement yesterday, as they're getting shuffled around Scotland from different barracks to different barracks. And it's not just us. Just have a look at some of the newspapers today. Some newspapers not noted for the support for this government, let me say. Ones which talk about almost universally of a betrayal of troops in Scotland. There's one particular leader which says it's headed up armed farces. That might give you a clue as to what they think about it. A few hundred more people put to play musical chairs around their barracks. It's hard to escape the conclusion that the government was just, the Tory government this is a statement we're talking about, was simply plucking numbers out of the air to stave off the flak. It does end up by saying, but it is a lie, and a lie is a lie is a lie, and there is no defence. That's what other people think about the Conservative Party's statement last night, from Philip Hammond's statement yesterday. So there's obviously not the same welcome for it that Alec Johnson would like to see me have. I don't welcome it. It's a betrayal of many promises that were made by his own former Defence Minister, Liam Fox. What we have to do now is try and see how we can mitigate the impact of that for the various communities across the country, and this SNP government will do that.
Roger Campbell.
Minister, it's disappointing that the UK Government has failed to provide the Scottish Government, or indeed Fife Council, with details of the numbers of troops coming to Lucas. But it seems likely that the number of personnel at Lucas will be about 450 less than promised by Liam Fox in July 2011, and approximately 350 less than the RAF numbers at that time. This will have an economic and social impact in my constituency. My constituents are disappointed. Does the Minister agree with me that rather than representing this as a union dividend for Lucas, this is more of a union IOU?
Minister.
I think Rod Campbell is right to point out that the real reaction to this, which is of most importance, is those in our local communities that are affected by this. Nobody in Lucas is going to be duped by what's been announced by the UK Government. It is the case, though, I visited RAF Lucas recently to find out some of the issues which are faced by personnel there and some of the transitional issues which they will face in moving from an RAF base to a largely army base. And I think there's a lot we can do in the Scottish Government to try and help that process take place. But there is no question a feeling of betrayal. I've remembered being involved in these things for many years now. Various accusations from both sides of this chamber, indistinguishable though they are, that Scotland, under the SNP, would reduce our air bases. They've reduced from 3 to 1 in the space of a year, and that shows some of the impact that they're having and the challenge that we have to try and mitigate that. And I'm sure that we can work with the community in Rod Campbell's constituency to make sure we can mitigate it as best we can, but it would be much better had that decision not been made.
Graham Pearson, followed by Colin Keogh.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. SNP proposals seem to focus on leaving us with one of the smallest defence budgets in Europe at £2.5 billion, even smaller than Denmark's, and proportionately less than currently spent across the UK. Does the Minister seriously suggest that all an independent Scotland's defence capability gaps can be furnished on the cheap, or do you intend introducing conscription to Scotland, just as his examples of Finland and Denmark already have?
Minister.
I am sure the public will note that in the question just asked, there was not one word of condemnation for the Conservative Liberal Government's announcement. I can also say, as far from getting on the cheap, I think Scotland currently is taken very cheaply by the UK Government. We commit around £3.3 billion just now to the UK's defence expenditure. We get in return around £2.5 billion. What could we do with that extra £800 million, amounting to around £7 billion over the last 10 years? What could we do with that in terms of mitigating against things like the bedroom tax or improving the equipment to our forces? And going back to a previous point that was made by Alec Johnson about the SNP doesn't want to commit troops to combat. We don't want to commit troops to illegal wars like Iraq, as the Members' Party did. We want to have a Scottish Defence Force properly funded and equipped.
Colin Keir, followed by Willie Rennie.
Would the Minister agree with me that the closure of military bases in Scotland, such as Craigie in my constituency, will have a devastating effect on the economy of local communities and shows that the biggest danger to the defence of Scotland is Westminster politicians who choose to lavish billions on new nuclear weapons while disproportionately cutting defence personnel here in Scotland?
Minister.
It's a very good point, and there are a number of military sources, both in terms of think tanks and so on, which say that it's unsustainable for the UK to have the current level number of troops that they have, as well as having the 1% increase in equipment budget, which the government was committed to, as well as having nuclear weapons. It's just not sustainable. This is what's fantasy about the defence politics in the UK today. And it's interesting to note in Colin Keir's area that the Royal Scots, bizarrely, are going to be moved to Belfast. And it's mentioned today, I think, in today's Evening News, that it's part of the strength and uniqueness of these proud and famous fighting Scots regiments that came with their link with the local community. Between the oldest regiment in the British Army, in this case, the Royal Scots, and its geographical and traditional recruiting base, Edinburgh and the Lothians. That is the nature of the thinking behind, if there is thinking behind this announcement. And I'm sure that we could organise things far better to maintain that link between our communities and our armed forces, which is so vital in a modern democracy.
Will Rennie, followed by Graham Day.
I thank the Minister for an advance copy of the statement. The Minister says that he is more than capable of making decisions on defence for Scotland, yet he omits any substantial or real reference to the Royal Navy and its new submarines on the Clyde. The new HMS Ambush, officially joined the fleet on Monday. Does the Minister welcome the decision to base all of the UK's conventionally armed submarines on the Clyde or not?
Minister.
Yes, it's true to say I didn't mention that because it wasn't mentioned in the statement by the UK Government to which I'm responding in this statement here. But if we are talking about the Royal Navy, and of course there are no combat-ready, if you like, units of the Royal Navy in Scotland, which is worth noting. But we do also have two carriers which are going to be constructed with no provision for aeroplanes to go on them. There is something seriously wrong at the heart of UK defence policy, and I do believe, as Willie Rennie started off by asking questions, that we could cope much better with these questions in Scotland democratically.
One moment, Mr Day. I've got 6 members who have requested to speak. I really would like to get through them, so can we have brief questions and brief answers? Graham Day, followed by Duncan McNeill.
One of the very few positive aspects of yesterday's announcement was that 4-5 Commando would be staying at RM Conda for the foreseeable future, which is welcome news for those Marines who have put down roots in the area, not to mention the local economy. But my constituency also is home to Barry-Budden, and I wonder if the Minister agrees that, given its close proximity to Condor and Leuchars, it's both logical and appropriate that, going forward, full use should be made of this training facility.
Minister.
That much more could be made of Barry-Budden, and it is a matter of some satisfaction that the previous proposal to take the sole remaining units of Royal Marines out of Scotland to elsewhere has been reversed, another about-turn. Interestingly, Barry-Budden relies very much on the local Marines as well as others for training in terms of live firing and in certain vehicles. It is emblematic, though, of the decision that was made, and it strikes me that there's been discussion lately of the UK Government making a right turn. This was not a right turn, this was an about turn, one which was so badly executed that had Philip Hammond done it in a parade ground, he'd been marched off and given extra duties.
Duncan McNeill, followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank the Minister for the statement. I think we shouldn't forget that yesterday was a sad and disappointing day, and as Jim Murphy said, a day that will not be forgiven lightly. We moved quickly, though, in the Minister's statement to then describe the benefits of independence, and we had a wee debate about different budgets. Can I ask the Minister, what would the start-up costs be for those Scottish Armed Forces? Much does one single jet fighter cost, or one conventional submarine? Because it's not simply the budgets we need to worry about. What are the start-up costs?
Minister.
Have they done any work?
I think it may be the case that Duncan McNeill has been reading and believing too closely the document that was recently produced by Jim Wallace, which suggested that, of course, we would start with nothing upon independence. And that's not the case. We have a share in the UK forces. We've contributed over many years. It's worth bearing in mind before he writes it off that Scotland has traditionally contributed between 10 and 14% of the personnel to the UK Armed Forces. That's a very substantial contribution. It's not the case we're starting from year zero. We start with a huge amount of experience and our share of the resources of the UK military defence establishment. What we can do is improve upon that, because currently we're paying a surcharge. We are paying a surcharge of around £700 million a year, more than we get back. We could do far more were we independent.
Bruce Crawford, followed by Richard Simpson.
It's interesting, Presiding Officer, that not one Labour member has criticised the Conservative outcome from yesterday. Quite remarkable. So let me bore down. Let me bore down into some criticism of the position. At Forthside and Stirling, we're seeing the 51st Brigade moving to Edinburgh, and the smart disposal of a very important site, which is shared by the Defence Support Group in the Stirling area, employing many people. Is the Minister concerned, like me, this is the first step to potentially removing the DSG, the Defence Support Group, from the Stirling area, and the potential loss of many jobs and the impact on the local economy?
Minister.
I do share these concerns and a number of other concerns, which really arise from the fact that there is so little detail in what's been put forward so far. I mean, it should have been the case that yesterday's announcement was also accompanied by an announcement of reserve forces across Scotland, so we could have some idea of what the impact would be there as well. I don't understand why that didn't happen, but Bruce Crawford's absolutely right. There are real uncertainties because we don't have the detail. And really, to not have any approach, any correspondence from a UK government, a UK minister, before this announcement was made, and instead to have a senior member from the military phoned today to try and provide some background. It is the case, of course, of government sending in the military to do things that they find very uncomfortable, I suppose. But it's the wrong way to go about it, and that's why there's the uncertainty in Bruce Crawford's area, as there will be in many other parts of Scotland.
Richard Simpson, followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Presiding Officer, can I begin by correcting Bruce Crawford and saying Duncan McNeill did just say Jim Murphy regrets this statement, and the Labour Party does as well. But can I ask him, taking into on the independence section of his statement, an independent Scotland would end up seeing none of the next generation of Royal Navy frigates being built in this country, which inevitably is going to have a huge impact on current and future jobs.
Order.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Minister how many naval bases the Scottish Government are planning to maintain in the event of a yes vote for an independent Scotland within a £2.5 billion budget, which is covering defence and security, so it isn't just defence?
Minister.
It is based, Richard Simpson's question is based on the fallacy that Scotland will have no need, of course, for vessels, whether it's for its Navy, whether it's for its Coast Guard, whether it's for the other services that we have around our coastline. Of course it's the case we're going to have to procure vessels for that, and we understand that point perfectly well. And of course it's the case that what is there just now with the UK Government is partly Scotland's. Of course we have a share in that. That is necessarily the case. And of course that means that we have to have a discussion with the UK Government. All I'm saying is that the discussion that we will have with the UK Government upon independence will be a far more rational, considered and measured discussion than what we've seen as part of this announcement yesterday, where you have, for example, as I've mentioned already, carriers being built with no provision for aircraft, where you see billions being spent on airplanes which are dismantled before they're completed. I'm pretty sure Scotland could do things in a better way than that.
Stuart Stevenson, followed by Murdo Fraser.
Is the Minister aware of the bitterness that burns bright in Murray at the closure of RAF Kinloss? Today the Minister has indicated there will be a small increase in numbers at Kinloss. In theory that's welcome, but is he aware that that takes no account of the P45s being dished out by this administration with gay abandon that will negate the effect of that? The bitterness remains.
Minister.
I think that is the background against which this decision was made and this statement was made yesterday, because we already have seen a vast number of redundancies. We're told by the MOD there will be 5,000 more redundancies across the UK, 1,000 perhaps from Scotland, some of which, of course, are being delivered to troops on the front line in Afghanistan. Who would have thought a Conservative government would have reduced themselves to that? It's absolutely the case that Scotland will lose out badly because of this, not least because, as Stuart Stevenson has mentioned, the cuts themselves take money out of the local communities. If you reduce to 900, a base which is going to have 1,500 people, you're taking a huge chunk of finance out of that local community. So the effect of this, as I said at the very start of my statement, will have an impact on Scotland both socially and economically.
Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Philip Hammond's announcement yesterday on moving troops to Lookers was warmly welcomed by both Fife Council and Fife Chamber of Commerce. Why do we see this negative carping tone from the Scottish Government today, when these local representatives are so positive?
Minister.
Well, perhaps Murdo Fraser has seen the comments of the community councils of Garbridge and nearby, who have been very concerned by this statement. Perhaps, like me, he's talked to the families that are currently there, or the communities. They're not welcoming the statement. They think this is a major change to Lookers, a diminution of what it was before, a change from an RAF base which had served the UK very well over many years, had settled in Scotland very effectively. So there's not this broad welcome. And if it was the case, are all the newspapers wrong? Are all the other personnel that we've talked to wrong? This has not been welcomed. People realise this is a complete betrayal of what was first announced by Liam Fox, and his attempt to try and hide that do Murdo Fraser no credit at all.
Finally, Drew Smith, very briefly, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The biggest challenge facing my constituents and thousands of defence workers in Glasgow is the future of the Clyde Yards, 90% of whose work comes from the MOD. Can the Minister explain what information the UK Government has provided to the Scottish Government about the likelihood of the MOD placing contracts for defence ships with what would become foreign yards on the Clyde in an independent Scotland? And is it the same information which the shipbuilding trade unions have, which is that the likelihood of the rest of the UK placing such orders is basically nil?
Minister, briefly.
Well, can I say, first of all, there's very little information come. He may be aware, may be supportive of the idea that the UK Government doesn't engage with the Scottish Government on these issues. They don't provide the information which has been talked about. And interestingly, the exact same process that was followed here, where the UK Government did not allow its ministers to even speak, not just to the Scottish Government or the Welsh Government or the local authorities, didn't allow them to even speak, means that we don't have that kind of information. But it's the same process that was followed for the West Coast Main Line. No contact whatsoever, comes like a bolt out of the blue, and there's no way that we can respond to that as quickly as we'd like to, if that's the case. Nor can we do the things that we should do in order to mitigate the effects. Well, interestingly, on the point about vessels, there was a statement made about, which I saw, about the fact that there be no foreign vessels built by the, or no vessels bought by the MOD in foreign yards. That is simply not true, and he should check his facts before asking a question like that.
Thank you. That ends the statement from the Minister. The next item of business is a debate on motion number 5813 in the name of Jackie Baillie on NHS waiting times. Can I also remind members to speak through the Chair by referring to other members by their full name and not as you? I invite members who wish to take part in the debate to press the request speak button now, and I call on Jackie Baillie to speak to and move the motion.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I very much welcome the opportunity to debate waiting times. This is a subject that is of considerable importance to patients and staff in the NHS, and people value the NHS. It is a much-loved institution, but, people do not need their confidence in the NHS undermined by the SNP's approach to healthcare. People want the best possible care as quickly as is possible. From referral from your GP to getting a diagnosis and then getting treatment can be an anxious time for patients and for their families, and anything that prolongs that wait clearly adds to the worry and uncertainty. We know that for many conditions, early diagnosis and early treatment can lead to much better health outcomes. So I think we all across the chamber recognise the importance of reducing waiting times. But the achievement of waiting times targets must be real. It mustn't be the only thing that matters to the government, because if that is the signal, then what we see is a distortion of behaviour. If all that matters are targets, this ends up having a negative impact on patient care. The Scottish Government's self-congratulatory motion is totally out of place in light of Audit Scotland's report and with the reality on the ground. What the Audit Scotland report demonstrated is that the focus was on targets rather than on patient care. They set out a picture of sharp rises in social unavailability at the same time as target times were reducing. A staggering 1 in 3 people were recorded as socially unavailable in June 2011. Then the NHS Lothian scandal broke. Boards were told to stop misusing the codes, and miracle of all miracles, the numbers of patients on social unavailability experienced dramatic drops. And of course, at the same time, waiting times start to rise and targets are breached. Warning bells were absolutely ringing. Audit Scotland also point out that 1 in 4 patients had an actual wait well in excess of what was recorded. Indeed, something like only 3% of cases were reported, against 23% that had waited much longer but remain unreported. So the evidence clearly shows social unavailability growing and the reporting of breaches being far less than the actual number recorded. And what I was disappointed to have confirmed is that the former Cabinet Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon, knew about it but chose to ignore those warning signs. In March 2010, Audit Scotland published their report into the management of waiting times. Their report made a number of observations, including NHS boards vary in how they deal with patients who do not and cannot attend appointments, and this may not always be appropriate. The report also finds that the NHS is not accurately recording all relevant information about patient waits, which makes it difficult to demonstrate that it's managing all patients correctly in line with the new guidance. There is wide variation in levels of social unavailability across 12 boards, and this implies that boards are applying the code differently, which has implications for patients. So Audit Scotland told you quite clearly in March 2010, but nothing was done. In evidence to the Public Audit Committee, members were told that in March 2011, Audit Scotland contacted the Scottish Government about the recommendations in their report to monitor progress. Audit Scotland were told by the Scottish Government new guidance is imminent. Now, my understanding of imminent, presiding officer, is that a decision is just round the corner or looming, not that it will take some 18 months before guidance is actually issued, long after NHS Lothian's deliberate retrospective manipulation of waiting times came to light. By this time, frankly, the horse had well and truly bolted. So what was going on? Is it legitimate to expect the Health Department to know what their own Statistics Division knew? Should we have expected the Cabinet Secretary to have seen the data? Well, the NHS Statistics Division say in the Sunday Times that they reported the figures for social unavailability on a quarterly basis to the Health Department. Was that to the Director of Workforce and Performance, whose responsibility includes waiting times? Did he report it to the Director General for Health or the Cabinet Secretary? Surely a policy area of such importance deserved closer scrutiny than it appears to have received. It beggars belief that nobody was monitoring this. Audit Scotland is clear. They say that during 2011, the focus, and I quote, was on meeting waiting times targets, and there was not enough scrutiny of the increasing number of patients recorded as unavailable. Their contention is that better use of the available information could have helped to identify concerns about the use of unavailability codes. So Audit Scotland told the Scottish Government in March 2010, they reminded them in March 2011, and despite the evidence before their very eyes, they did absolutely nothing. Not one single iota of action was taken, not by the officials, not by the senior management team at St Andrew's House, not by the Cabinet Secretary herself. And the consequence? Thousands of patients, thousands of them, have been let down by the SNP, parked on hidden waiting lists, in some cases with no end date as a way of managing the waiting time targets. The whole system was focused on avoiding a breach instead of focusing on the patient. And contrary to what the Cabinet Secretary has said, I don't blame the hard-working nurses and doctors that are trying their best with fewer and fewer resources. You know, you cannot remove 2,000 nurses from the NHS without consequences. Nor do I blame the waiting list managers who are under enormous pressure to deliver, some of them off sick with stress. It is the SNP that have put an obsession with targets ahead of patient care. And I think it was James Callaghan that once said, "The sky has darkened with the wings of chickens coming home to roost." The sky is very dark indeed when you consider Nicola Sturgeon's handling of waiting times. But don't worry, Alex Neil is there to clean up her mess. But even Alex Neil is encountering some difficulty. When NHS Lothian first came to light, Nicola Sturgeon said that this was an isolated case. She had, after all, received assurances from all chief executives of all health boards that they were acting in line with the waiting times guidance. Well, they would say that, presiding officer, wouldn't they? But the BMA tell us that feedback from our members would suggest that this aggressive management style is not isolated to Lothian. And let's just let that statement sink in. Our doctors are telling us that pressure and bullying on waiting list staff is more widespread, with growing allegations about a bullying culture in the NHS. What action has the Cabinet Secretary taken, or indeed what action did his predecessor take? Then we had Alex Neil telling the Chamber in December that waiting times data was reliable and accurate. And then just a few weeks ago, we were treated to the Cabinet Secretary's Little Britain defence of "the computer says no." It was all just an IT problem. Well, you know, you can't have it both ways. You cannot say the data is reliable and accurate and at the same time tell us that actually there was a problem with the IT system that didn't record the information properly. The Cabinet Secretary might wish to pause and reflect on developing a consistent line. But let's look a bit closer at what the SNP claims, that it's all just one big IT problem and that's why social unavailability has dropped. I asked Audit Scotland whether that was a reasonable assumption to make. Their response from the Auditor-General was there has not been a significant change in IT systems over that period. So the drop is not due to any change in IT. He has, of course, said that everything's been sorted. The unavailability codes have been abolished. We also have a new waiting time guarantee of 12 weeks from decision to treat to receiving the treatment. Plans have been approved by health boards based on the new guidance and, in turn, agreed by the Health Department. So can the Cabinet Secretary explain why we are already seeing a postcode lottery and considerable variation in treatment? Some patients will receive 7 days' notice of appointments, others 21 days' notice. Some patients will get 2 chances for appointments, others will only get 1 before being consigned to the back of the queue. Some patients will be offered treatment in just their health board area, others will be offered treatment in different areas and different sectors. In a letter to the Herald yesterday, he says that this new waiting time guarantee has already been achieved. 99.9% of all cases are meeting the new target. Well, I have to say the 0.1% where it's not being achieved must all live in my constituency. We can have very little confidence in the accuracy of waiting times. The systems used to capture the information have been discredited and they couldn't be properly interrogated by Audit Scotland. And if they couldn't extract the data, how on earth can we be sure of what you're saying? Tell my constituents about your 99.9% achievement. Tell Miss M. She is 21 years old and an athlete. She has a hip injury. She's waited 12 months for an MRI scan. She's been told she'll need to wait 5 months for an operation. This young woman's life is on hold. Was her case reported as a breach, or has she been parked on a hidden waiting list somewhere? What about Mrs D? She has a problem with her gallbladder, was referred by her GP on the 21st of August. On the 3rd of October, her consultant took the decision to treat, but guess what? She's still waiting. Has this been reported as a breach, or is she too parked on a hidden waiting list somewhere? And what about Margaret Gray, who came to my surgery 2 weeks ago? She attended her GP in July 2012 with severe pain in her right knee. As it wasn't improving, she was sent for an X-ray and then referred to a consultant on the 12th of October. She had a scan on the 11th of January. She was told she'd need to wait 2 weeks for the results. Guess what, presiding officer? She's still waiting for the results, waiting for the treatment. Her waiting time guarantee has been breached, but Margaret is off work on sick leave, and she may lose her job due to the delays in treatment. That is the reality for Scots. And our SNP MSPs seriously saying that they haven't had similar examples brought to them by constituents with concerns about how long they wait. This is about people's lives. So what does the Cabinet Secretary say to my constituents? What does he say to all of our constituents who are not meeting his treatment target? But let me now, presiding officer, turn to A&E waiting times. There's no doubt that these are the worst set of waiting times for accident and emergency since the SNP came to power. The target has not been met across Scotland as a whole since 2009. The number of patients seen within the 4-hour waiting time target has fallen to the lowest level recorded since the target was introduced, and the number of patients who spend more than 12 hours waiting rose to 323, the highest on record. Here in NHS Lothian, 75 spent more than 12 hours in A&E in January alone. The Cabinet Secretary said at the time that the experience of John McGarity, an 84-year-old man left to wait on a trolley for 8 hours in a freezing cold corridor, was not a true reflection of the NHS. Tell that to the family of Mary Scott. Mary, who was a feisty and sprightly 93-year-old. She had a stroke, and aside from waiting 6 hours for an ambulance to arrive, she had to wait on a trolley for 6 hours for a bed. You can imagine the stress of that wait on her and her family. Tell the 323 patients waiting even longer than Mr McGarity or Mrs Scott that this isn't a reflection of the NHS under the SNP. And nurses, too, tell us a different story. It is a common occurrence to have old and very ill people lined up in corridors on trolleys because there are not enough beds. In some cases, these are the lucky ones. Others don't make it out of the waiting room because there are no trolleys for staff to put people on. The RCN tells us that the current reality is that whilst nurses and other healthcare staff are trying to do their best, there are not enough staff or beds or resources within the system. Now, the SNP can ignore me if they want. They can even ignore the journalists who they disagree with. But it ill beholds the Cabinet Secretary to ignore what doctors and nurses are telling him. You can't ignore what you've been told. The system is on the point of breaking. The Cabinet Secretary announces £50 million. That'll make it all right. And whilst I welcome this initially, as more detail emerged, the announcement appeared to be an exercise in smoke and mirrors. It doesn't deal with providing extra beds, and nurses tell us that that is the problem. And when you look closer, it's not new money. It's funding that will be taken from health boards, repackaged, tied with a fancy ribbon and handed right back to them. This is nothing less than a Cabinet Secretary reacting to events and headlines. It's not strategic, it's not planned, it isn't sensible. And when the Cabinet Secretary, what he didn't want you to know is that hidden away in that announcement was a cut in the waiting times target. Now, instead of 98%, he has cut the target to 95%. Was this announced to Parliament, or to doctors and nurses, or even to the people of Scotland? No. This admission of failure was sneaked out, and some might accuse the Cabinet Secretary of moving the goalposts, others would call it cheating. Presiding Officer, in closing, the SNP are responsible for this mess. They're responsible for thousands of people being parked on hidden waiting lists. What is worse is that the warning signs were there and they did nothing. And now, instead of coming clean about the challenges the NHS faces because of the choices that the SNP have made to cut nurses and beds, they move the goalposts, they change A&E waiting times in a spectacular sleight of hand. This is a sneaky and dishonest approach, which is more about spin than it is about patient care. And frankly, Presiding Officer, the people of Scotland deserve much better.
Thank you very much. I'm not certain if you moved your motion. Would you like to move your motion?
Happy to move the motion.
Thank you very much. I now call on Cabinet Secretary Alec Neil to speak to and move Amendment 5813.2. Cabinet Secretary, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. As you know, Presiding Officer, I used to go to Ayr Academy, and the school motto is Res Picky, Pros Picky. Look backward, look forward. All I can say about Jackie Baillie is she's all Res Picky and nae Pros Picky. Can I say that I welcome this opportunity to yet again put on record my gratitude for the dedication and commitment of our hard-working NHS staff across Scotland, and in doing so I am proud to move the amendment in my name. This government, unlike the Labour Party, has the highest respect for the staff in the NHS, and unlike them, we do not seek to paint a picture of dishonesty and a lack of integrity. Now, Presiding Officer, let us get things in perspective. As the First Minister said last week, well, of course there are problems in the National Health Service, but the National Health Service this year will spend £12 billion. 6 million times this year, someone in the National Health Service in Scotland will see a doctor. Over 1.5 million people will be referred to accident and emergency. One half of our entire population have something wrong with them at any one time. 1/3 of the population have more than one thing wrong with them at any one time. And clearly, for any health service, these are major challenges. But let me begin by pointing out, Presiding Officer, one of the big policy differences between us and the Labour Party is that we made a commitment which we have stuck to since 2007, that we would pass on every penny of the Barnett consequentials every year for the health service in Scotland. They refused to make that commitment. And I can tell you, Presiding Officer, if they had been in power over the last 6 years, over that 6-year period, the total amount of money spent in the National Health Service would have been £1.1 billion less than what it has been under this administration. And can I also say, Presiding Officer, Jackie Baillie and her mob have a real cheek. They have a real cheek to complain about waiting times in accident and emergency. If you look at the figures per board, two of the areas that had problems and have had more problems than most were Ayrshire and Arran and NHS Lanarkshire. What did they try to do in Ayrshire and Arran and NHS Lanarkshire? They wanted to close the accident and emergency unit at Monklands and the accident and emergency unit at Ayr Hospital. And had they succeeded in doing so, the A&E waiting times today would have been much, much worse than the problems we've had over the winter. But let us look, Presiding Officer, at the difference between their performance and our performance. Prior to this government coming to power, patients were waiting 6 months for an outpatient consultation following a referral from a GP, a dentist or optometrist. 6 months wait for inpatient and day case treatment. No target for diagnostic tests. No delivery of the old 62-day cancer target at the beginning of 2007, with only 84.6% of cancer patients starting their treatment within 62 days, and tens of thousands of patients on a hidden waiting list and left to languish for treatment with a guarantee removed. They don't have the moral right to criticise anybody because their performance was dreadful. Under this government, Presiding Officer, waiting times are now significantly better and, on the basis of an OECD comparison, amongst the best in Europe. On cancer, we delivered the old 62-day target by December 2008. We've also extended this target to include thousands of more patients a year who are referred through the screening programme. We've added an additional target that 95% of patients diagnosed with cancer start their treatment within 31 days, and we continue to deliver on both those targets. We extended the outpatient waiting time standard to include all source referrals, such as consultant-to-consultant referrals, something they never did. This means that tens of thousands more patients are covered by our waiting standard than under their administration. On diagnostic tests, most patients are now receiving one of the 8 key diagnostic tests within 4 weeks. We also continue to deliver the 18 weeks referral to treatment time standard, and latest figures show 90.9% of patients receive treatment within 18 weeks from initial referral. We have also enshrined in law a 12-week treatment time guarantee for inpatients and day case, and 99.9% was achieved in the first quarter, a percentage that we never get anywhere near for anything. No, you wouldn't, so I'm not. All of this shows that this government is committed to patients being treated more quickly and that more patients are being covered by our waiting time standards. And let me say something about the recording. Let me just quote, because Jackie Baillie is trying to say you can't have any trust. Well, let me quote the UK Statistics Authority in 2010. It published an assessment of compliance with the Code of Practice for Official Statistics on waiting times, and the report found that the changes introduced through our New Ways programme improved the quality of the statistics, and it stated, and I quote exactly, judges that the statistics covered by our report were readily accessible, produced according to good methods and managed impartially and objectively in the public interest, a claim that they could never make about any statistic on health or anything else. So let me also turn to the allegations being made by Jackie Baillie about widespread manipulation of waiting times, which is a real slur on hundreds of NHS staff throughout Scotland. This is totally unfounded, and indeed, at last week's Public Audit Committee, Carol Gardner, the Auditor-General, stated, and I quote, we have not, read my lips, we have not found evidence of manipulations at all. And she did go on to say, as I have pointed out, that the IT systems do need to be improved. So under this administration, we have made significant improvements, Presiding Officer, and we have replaced social unavailability and placed in legislation patient-advised unavailability. The directions for the legal treatment time guarantee places a clear duty on boards to not only record the period of unavailability, but also the reasons for it. And the boards also have a duty to write and confirm to patients any periods unavailability applied. Presiding Officer, let me finally just make this point. In relation to A&E, they didn't actually measure what happened against their target. They were too feared. They only had one survey in April 2006, and 87.6% of patients waited less than 4 hours. That compares in December at the maximum period of challenge in December last year, when we achieved over 90%. So if you compare the two records, Presiding Officer, we're going to vote next year on two futures, but let's look at two records. A very poor record of not measuring, not performing, not delivering, and our record of measuring, targeting, performing and delivering for the people of Scotland.
Many thanks. I now call on Nanette Milne to speak to and move Amendment 5813.1. 6 minutes, please, Ms Milne.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Throughout the lifetime of this Parliament, and certainly in the decade since I became a member of it, waiting times for treatment have been regarded as a key benchmark of success for the NHS in Scotland. And there is no doubt that during that time they have improved significantly, so that now, following adoption of the 18-week referral to treatment standard at the end of 2011, patients' expectation is rightly that they should have hospital treatment within 18 weeks of referral from their GP. Waiting time reductions are, of course, welcome, because nobody wants to wait any longer than they have to for treatment. However, waiting times are not the only indicators of good health care, and patient outcomes, readmission rates and healthcare-associated infections are equally, if not more important, in assessing NHS performance. But a key focus in recent years has been on waiting times, with increasingly demanding targets set by government, which have been met only because of very hard work by a dedicated and conscientious NHS workforce, who are under constant pressure from management, who have to answer in turn to their political masters. There has undoubtedly been a loss of morale amongst hard-pressed hospital staff, and anecdotes abound from staff and patients about manipulation of waiting lists. The BMA, in its briefing for this debate, quotes from general surgical staff interviewed in November 2010 for the NHS Lothian Independent Report, who said, if we are about to breach targets, we have to cancel inpatient scans in favour of outpatients. Inpatients are usually more urgent, but the target gets priority every time. And I've heard more than once of management dropping a major case from an operating list drawn up by a surgeon and replacing it with several more minor procedures which would assist in meeting a target. Staff and patients have raised concerns about this sort of behaviour, but there haven't until now been effective whistle-blowing policies within health boards to allow people to raise their concerns safely and in the knowledge that they'll be acted on. And I know I'm not alone in welcoming this year's pilot of a national confidential phone line. It's just a pity it wasn't in place sooner. What happened in Lothian is, of course, scandalous, and NHS Tayside's inappropriate use of unavailability codes is unacceptable. And although it's reassuring that Audit Scotland's recent report didn't find any widespread manipulation of waiting times across Scotland, nonetheless it is concerning that social unavailability codes were used by many NHS boards with inadequate controls and audit trails and limited information in patient records, so that it was impossible to determine whether inappropriate use of these codes was due to human error, inconsistent interpretation of guidance or deliberate manipulation of waiting lists. The inadequate scrutiny of a mounting number of patients recorded as unavailable for treatment because of a focus on meeting targets, and, to paraphrase the Audit Scotland report, trying to improve capacity in areas where patients were waiting longer, resulted in a failure by both government and health boards to see the broader picture of the pressures that were building up in the system around the capacity within NHS boards to meet waiting times targets. I hope that lessons will be learned from recent sorry events, and that Audit Scotland's recommendations to government, to NHS boards and to their non-executive directors and to ISD Scotland will be carried out in the interest of both patients and NHS staff. With regard to A&E services, a drop since 2009 in the number of patients assessed and either admitted, transferred or discharged within 4 hours of arrival, from the targeted 98% then to 90.3% last December, isn't acceptable. But I'm not convinced that the solution should be to lower that target to 95%, as the Government has done without telling Parliament. But I do welcome an increase in the number of A&E consultants and the proposed £50 million unscheduled care action plan, and hope that this will go some way to giving A&E patients the prompt diagnosis and care which they deserve in a 21st century NHS service. Presiding Officer, I think that recent history has borne out what the BMA and the clinicians they represent, and to be fair, my own party, have been saying for years to the previous coalition governments and to the current SNP administration, that clinical priorities can be skewed by pressure to achieve centrally driven targets. Patients should be treated within the NHS according to their needs, with clinical decisions taking precedence and clinicians supported in carrying out the care which they know is right for their patients.
Can I thank the member for taking an intervention? Can I just put it on the record to say that where we do get evidence that any target or standard is distorting clinical decisions, I would be happy to review that target or standard, because clearly the intention is to deliver, and we do not want distortion, artificial distortion of clinical decisions, either driven by targets or anything else. So if I get evidence, I'm prepared to look at it.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that, and I welcome what he said, and believe me, I will be in touch if need be. Unfortunately, when centrally imposed targets do become the driving force, intense pressure is put on NHS services, and clinical decision-making can be distorted against the best interests of patients. This in time can impact negatively on a hard-working and committed workforce, which is focused on doing its very best for the patients in its care. Of course, targets are needed in a health service which has to be mindful of finite resources and which faces increasing and unrelenting demand from an ageing population living with many long-term health problems. But it's very important, to quote the BMA, that these targets are based on clinical evidence and appropriate patient care. I think it's very disappointing that waiting times targets and waiting lists have become highly politicised, with both of the main parties using them to score points against each other. As my colleague Jackson Carlow said in a previous debate, we're not interested in disputing which administration did better at getting people off waiting lists. We want to secure what's best for patients. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, I hope the Health Secretary, who's made it clear that he wants to listen to staff and learn how it really is at the coalface of the NHS, will pay careful heed to the Audit Scotland report and listen to the BMA and the clinicians within our hospitals, so that in future treatment can be planned according to the needs of patients rather than the need to satisfy waiting times targets set by government. I move the amendment in my name.
Many thanks. And we now move to open debate, and I call on Bob Doris to be followed by Neil Findlay. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I believe the Labour motion before us this afternoon is growing evidence of the decision to use the NHS overtly as a political football to seek party advantage, rather than what you'd expect from a responsible opposition, which is to use this Parliament to improve the NHS for the people of Scotland. That is their duty. It is in sorrow then, rather than anger, that I call into question the motivation behind the Labour Party motion. I would hope that we could unite across party boundaries where possible to support our NHS. However, I believe that the current Labour strategy only seeks to create conflict quite deliberately, and it can also only serve to potentially demoralise many hard-working NHS employees and disengage the public whom we all seek to serve. The first sentence in the motion before us by Labour refers to a hidden waiting times scandal. This is preposterous and demonstrates an onerous statement to make, and I shall go on to prove that quite clearly. Firstly, when Nicola Sturgeon and the Scottish Government abolished the shameful hidden waiting list inherited from the Labour and Liberal Democrat executive, waiting lists for the first time since devolution received the full glare of public scrutiny. Let us not forget that up to one-third of patients were removed from regular waiting lists altogether and were left languishing on hidden waiting lists, some of them for many years, without treatment. That was the position that this government inherited. That was unacceptable. That previous system treated patients as an irrelevance. They used an accounting process in order that patients in waiting lists simply disappeared in a fashion that even David Copperfield would have been rightly proud of. Labour must apologise for that situation if it is ever to start to regain any credibility with the NHS. So what progress has been made since Labour were kicked out of power in 2007? Under the new wage system brought in by the SNP government, all patients were accounted for the first time on waiting lists in a system that was open to public scrutiny. There is now nothing hidden in terms of waiting lists under this Scottish Government, and Labour would do better to have a constructive discussion on how we improve matters further. The Labour motion also notes wrongly a supposed waiting time scandal. I want to focus on the time period during which Audit Scotland said there were issues in terms of how data was recorded. Let me be clear. There were shortcomings in many of the matters that need to be addressed have either already been attended to or are currently being attended to. However, let's look at the waiting times experiences of all patients during the period in question. In doing so, I refer to ISD data, which includes patients who were designated as socially unavailable or medically unavailable and may have had periods of delay as a result. So, irrespective of social or medical unavailability, we find that 94.3% of all patients, including those who had delays, 94.3% of all patients were treated within 18 weeks. That is a figure to be proud of, but let me stress, not one to be complacent of. Record levels of attainment in terms of waiting times targets being met are not my definition of a scandal, only in the parallel alternative universe of the Labour opposition within this chamber. Audit Scotland did not suggest a lack of progress in waiting times targets. They suggested, quite rightly, the need to better record reasons for patient delays, and that is what the NHS are seeking to address. And I'm also pleased to hear much of the Scottish Government response to date. I also think the Labour Party tend to ignore the vast majority of patient experiences. And let me say that every patient experience that has been negative, that has been put to this chamber today, is one that should be taken seriously. But the vast majority of patient experiences are completely ignored by the Labour Party. So they completely ignore the 88% satisfaction rating that the NHS has in Scotland. And let me stress again, I want to look at how the 12% that we have to further engage with and improve the quality of service to them. But Labour completely ignore the vast majority of people who are happy with the NHS. And let me just give you one example, because Jackie Bailey gave it lots of examples. How about the patient in my area that I represent who said, "Splendid. Many thanks to all the Southern General and Glasgow Royal Infirmary staff for looking after my 83-year-old mother during her operation on the 10th of January. Splendid care from a splendid staff and a splendid organisation. No wonder our NHS is the envy of the world." Completely ignored by the Labour Party for a cheap tabloid headline ahead of patient care. And that is just absolutely scandalous. Let me say something the Labour Party could do to actually shine some scrutiny on this, because at the Public Audit Committee, the Auditor-General actually said there's a particularly good use of waiting times targets, and that is where they are not met, because where they are not met, it identifies a financial gap or a provision gap, and they would expect the NHS to act to that. So it's in that light when I look at NHS targets on accident and emergency waiting times for 4 hours, and I point out considerably better than they were under the Labour Party, but still, quite frankly, not good enough. And then we see the £50 million of investment in unscheduled care action plan to address that. So where targets are met, we should be proud of our NHS. Where we fall just short, we allocate and reallocate resources to address that fact, and that's a quality NHS, well funded by this government, that the Labour Party would have not supported financially had they got into power, and be where we are standing in this chamber.
Many thanks. Now call on Neil Findlay to be followed by Mark MacDonald. 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. Again, we hear Government Ministers repeating their well-worn mantras about the SNP's alleged great successes in the NHS, regurgitating the lines about record levels of patient satisfaction, and that old chestnut that we hear time and time again, patronising the NHS staff for their hard work and commitment, inferring that any criticism of government policy is somehow an attack on nurses, doctors and the hospital staff working under intense pressure. The reality is that the concerns that we raise, more often than not, come from these very staff who are being worked into the ground, trying to cope with a system that is increasingly under strain. Presiding Officer, as politicians, we should know what is happening in the NHS in our constituencies and in our regions. We have caseloads that reflect the realities of the cuts to budgets, the reductions in staffing levels and the lack of resources and falling morale. Or is it just me that has that in my caseload? I don't think so. I'm sure most members do. In my region, the waiting times issue has been the bad penny that just keeps on returning. Last year, the manipulation of waiting times and the use of social unavailability was exposed at NHS Lothian, and it pains me that my region is seen as the benchmark of bad performance in this area. And of course, that scandal was compounded by a culture of bullying and harassment, where senior management bellowed decrees down the chain of command, not in the interests of patients and their care, but to pockle the waiting list system and make it look as though imposed targets were being met. And we know that this was a scandal that ministers had been alerted to but did nothing about. A scandal that resulted in no one yet being held to account for their actions. Indeed, the chief executive, the head of the organisation, waltzed off into the sunset with a £375,000 retirement package. Now, if a porter or a canteen assistant was guilty of aggressive long-term bullying and lied about a major element of their work and what they had to report to their superiors, then they would have been dismissed in an instant. But there appears to be one rule for the workers in the NHS and one rule for the bosses. Well, I'm afraid some things never change. Last week it was revealed that waiting times in accident emergency units were the worst for 5 years. So bad that it moved Margaret Watt, Chair of the Patients Association, to remark that the figures in waiting times in accident and emergency in Scotland are shocking. And her remarks reflect the real world. Across Scotland, only 4 NHS boards have met the target to have admitted, transferred or discharged 98% of their patients within 4 hours of entering A&E. The national average for December was 90.3, and in Lothian the average 86.2, a fall from 92.6 in September. So what do these figures mean for the people who lie behind them? For patients, it is intolerable. Sick children or elderly people having to wait anxiously in A&E for hours on end as the staff are run ragged trying to cope. And as Jackie Bailey said, Mr Neil tried to suggest that the long waiting times in A&E faced by Mr McGarity, who waited on a trolley in a corridor for over 8 hours, was not a true reflection of the NHS. Well, I'll have to say to the Cabinet Secretary, if he maybe would pay the courtesy of listening, that this was Mr McGarity's experience of the NHS, and it was the experience of 75 patients in Lothian who were stuck in A&Es for over 12 hours in January, well over double the figure of just 1 year ago. So why are waiting times worsening, and why do NHS boards feel the need to distort the figures? Well, it's because the NHS is under intense pressure. We see cuts to bed, cuts to nurses, midwives and cuts to support staff, and those left behind expected to do more for less, seeing their caseloads increase to almost unmanageable levels, and all the while their wages are frozen. And the upshot is that staff in the NHS already suffering under strain, and Lothian are now having to do even more to put right the cases affected by the waiting times scandal. That is the reality, and no amount of ministerial bluster can deny it. And of course, the Minister knows this, because NHS Lothian have had to pour £27 million into trying to sort out the waiting list scandal, and which has resulted in a feast for the private sector. Presiding Officer, 2 weeks ago I attended a packed meeting of West Lothian Community Councils in Blackburn. The meeting was called to discuss their concerns about the NHS, and the message from that meeting was absolutely clear. People are not prepared to accept what they see going on in the NHS day in, day out. Don't take my word for it, Cabinet Secretary. Speak to your colleagues Fiona Hislop and Angela Constance, and they will tell you about the angry comments that they were subjected to at that meeting. So, Presiding Officer, the people there had good reason to be angry. On top of the waiting list fiasco, we've had the temporary closure of the children's wards at St John's during the summer, threats to services like homeopathy, community podiatry and the hospital nursery, all either facing closure temporarily or on a permanent basis. So, Presiding Officer, I would appeal to the Government, stop the spin, stop the bluster, face up to the realities of what are happening in our communities, because these are very, very serious issues.
Many thanks. Now Colin Drew-Smith, to be followed by Kevin Stewart. Up to 6 minutes, please. I do beg your pardon, Mark MacDonald, to be followed by Drew-Smith. Up to 6 minutes, forgive me.
I thank Mr Findlay for pointing out to the Presiding Officer that he'd forgotten to call me. Presiding Officer, sometimes I wonder what life is like in the world occupied by Jackie Baillie. I envisage it's a dank, dark, depressing place, forever to be viewed through the prism of a half-empty glass. Meanwhile, in the real world, those of us are wondering why it is that there's Labour Party does appear to have such a low threshold for a scandal. Indeed, as the Cabinet Secretary pointed out at the Audit Committee just the other week, the Auditor-General stated quite clearly, as we have said in the report and as I have said today, we have not found any evidence of manipulation at all. Indeed, the key messages section of the Audit Scotland report states our sampling found a small number of instances in which unavailability codes were used inappropriately. And yet, to listen to what Jackie Baillie was saying, you would assume that this was widespread and there were hundreds and thousands of examples beyond those which Audit Scotland had identified. Jackie Baillie is simply going with supposition rather than evidence, which is what Audit Scotland presented at the Audit Committee. Indeed, the BMA themselves state quite clearly the BMA are satisfied that the Audit Scotland report on waiting times in Scotland did not find any widespread manipulation of waiting times across the NHS boards in Scotland. Now, I know Jackie Baillie hung herself out to dry when she started to claim that things like NHS Tayside were an example of widespread manipulation of the figures. She should at least have the humility to accept that the reality does not match up to her rhetoric. And let's then look, though, at the comparison with the situation, because if this is what Jackie Baillie qualifies as a scandal, one can only imagine what she would have referred to the Labour Party's record on these matters, where we had around 35,000 people stuck on waiting lists with no waiting time guarantee and no published statistics on the length of their wait. That's a scandal, Ms Baillie, not what is currently being reported as such by yourself. But the notion that is being put across by the Labour Party that everyone on a social unavailability code has been parked or is being put there inappropriately, which is the implication, the direct implication from Jackie Baillie's speech, is frankly untrue. There are perfectly good reasons why people do find themselves socially unavailable. Indeed, I myself could have found myself in a position of having to be socially unavailable had the surgery I required last year been only available in the months that Parliament was in session. Luckily, I was offered an appointment during a period of recess, therefore I was able to take up the appointment, but I could quite feasibly have found myself being socially unavailable at that time. But the BMA briefing quite clearly states it is important to recognise, however, that waiting times...
Point of order. Neil Findlay.
Presiding Officer, I wonder if you could tell me, I was always under the impression that this was a debating chamber. I wonder if you could advise me if that's still the case.
It is order! It is a debating chamber. This is not a point of order. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I also thought that the understanding was that it was for the person who was speaking to determine when and if and which interventions they accepted, not for Mr Findlay to use his tried and tested bully boy tactics to try and muscle in on my time speaking. and I hope you might give me a little bit of time back, Presiding Officer, for that spurious point of order. But the BMA briefing, Presiding Officer, the BMA briefing makes quite clear it is important to recognise, however, that waiting times are not the only or the most important indicator of performance. Patient outcomes, readmission rates, healthcare-associated infections, etc., are also important indicators of the quality of care received. It is important not to lose sight of these in favour of throughput and patients being seen quickly. So let's look at some of those statistics, shall we? Since 2008, a 12.4% reduction in hospital mortality, equating to 8,500 lives saved. A 24% reduction in C. diff and a 10% reduction in MRSA, MSSA in 2011-12, and between 2007-8 to 2011-12, a cumulative fall of 78% in C. diff and 35% in MRSA, MSSA. That shows real progress on hospital-acquired infections, belying the rhetoric of Jackie Baillie, who tried to paint Scotland as the hospital superbug capital of Europe, of course forgetting that she was referring to figures when she was in power, not this government. 272,000 alcohol brief interventions to tackle harmful and hazardous drinking over the last 4 years, a reduction in the rate of emergency bed days for people aged 75 and over by 10.9% since 2006-07, delivering 48,000 inequalities-targeted cardiovascular health checks in 2011-12, reduction in Scotland's suicide rate of 17% between 2002 to 2011. These are real results for real patients in Scotland, and I think the BMA have been instructive in their advice to us to look at what often lies behind the statistics as well in terms of outcomes for patients, and we should always remember that it's the outcomes that matter. That's why it is important to look at patient satisfaction ratings and how those compare. And yes, we can never be complacent in regard to the NHS, because this has been made quite clear. It is a human organisation, and within any human organisation, errors will occur. Even in the Labour Party, errors occasionally occur, such as bringing this debate to the Chamber today. But occasionally, human organisations will have errors, and it's important to learn the lessons from those errors and understand how to put them right. And that is always the task that we must be faced with. But we know the real game here, Presiding Officer. The real game of the Labour Party was given away by their press release in advance of this debate. The real game is, one, to attack Nicola Sturgeon because they recognise that Nicola Sturgeon is quite rightly viewed as an asset not just to this government but to this nation, and two, to save Jackie Baillie's rapidly diminishing credibility because she'd overcooked the pudding in relation to the NHS waiting time scandal. My advice to the Labour Party is they should set themselves more achievable targets.
Many thanks. Now call on Drew Smith, to be followed by Kevin Stewart. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Two groups should be at the heart of this debate. Firstly, patients, those to whom promises on waiting times are made, and frontline staff, those who are left to deliver the promises which ministers make. Like other members on this side, I have questioned ministers about waiting times on a number of occasions, and my concern has principally been with what is happening in Glasgow. But I have also been in this chamber when colleagues on this side have warned the Scottish Government that things were going wrong, and I have seen the denials of ministers at every stage of this scandal. The question I have asked on a number of occasions has been for a simple assurance that none of my constituents in Glasgow have waited longer than they should have because of inappropriate manipulation of waiting lists. Despite all of the heat and noise that has been generated, I have never had that guarantee, and I suspect that I won't get it from the Scottish Government today. So here's what Audit Scotland has said about this specific question. And Bob Doris, in his splendid speech, might have felt the need to take note when he claimed that the figures had always been open and transparent. The actual time patients waited is longer than the waiting time reported in national performance reports. Audit Scotland. 3% of patients were officially recorded as waiting more than 9 weeks. 23% of patients actually did so. Audit Scotland. The biggest difference in the number of patients was, Mr Doris, in NHS Greater Glasgow and Clyde, where it was, according to Audit Scotland, page 29, 5,000 patients. Since the initial indications of this scandal, there have been assertions, excuses, carefully worded obfuscations. First, these allegations were simply malicious lies, apparently made up by the Labour Party. Then they were a small and isolated example of malpractice. Then we had internal reports which were claimed as exonerations of board managers when they contained no such thing. A national inquiry by Audit Scotland has revealed startling statistics, including an example of 900 orthopaedic patients at the Western Infirmary, a hospital along with the Victoria Infirmary in Glasgow is experiencing severe pressures. 900 patients with painful conditions, all apparently socially unavailable at the same time. At every stage of this scandal, the Scottish Government and the SNP have denied everything and shouted loudly at anyone who dares to ask them questions. Labour called for a whistleblowers helpline because we did not believe that abuse could be happening without anyone knowing. Our request was ignored, then rejected, and then finally acceded to only when the denials and inaction became untenable. If I have one quibble with the motion in front of us today, it is on the suggestion that clear warnings were overlooked. I don't think the warnings were overlooked, Presiding Officer. The warnings and those making them were hotly dismissed by the very person who made her own career blaming every dropped bedpan in the NHS on the previous Scottish Executive. The reason that the Scottish National Party is in such a mess on this issue is simple. When faced with a scandal, the former Cabinet Secretary did nothing but belittle those who have asked her for answers when she should have been asking the questions herself. Now, Nicola Sturgeon is not in the chamber today, but the backbenchers who cheered and jeered with her then are now having to defend the latest defence, and it was good to see the Minister for Commonwealth Games back to do that with us again. The latest defence definitions of unavailability are being rewritten. Patients themselves might have caused the problem. Targets are being decried as the problem. Computers and IT systems are to blame. Just as on college funding, on blankets on wards, reality is denied until reality confronts the SNP in the face. SNP MSPs who a few weeks ago were still arguing that there was no problem are now all falling over themselves to tell us that they actually understand the problem better than anyone else. And Neil Findlay was absolutely right. The lack of confidence in waiting times data provided by this government is now the reality. When waiting times were being trumpeted as falling, social unavailability skyrocketed. When social unavailability was uncovered to be the SNP's heading waiting lists and begins to fall, the officially approved figures, somehow, the officially approved waiting time figures, go back up again. What a surprise. Even now, we are supposed to believe that the problem, which of course never actually existed, has now been resolved. Patients are still facing inequalities in how waiting lists are being managed across the country. The result of the legal right to treatment policy, which the Scottish Government has signed off, is that my constituents in Glasgow will receive 7 days' notice of an appointment. In Lanarkshire, it's 3 weeks. In Glasgow, patients will have their waiting time clock reset if they turn down one appointment, Mr Doris. In Lanarkshire, 2 appointments will be offered. The Scottish Government have approved a new postcode. No, thank you, Mr Mason. The Scottish Government have approved a new postcode lottery, and once again, my constituents in Glasgow will lose out. Not least because equality impact assessments have not been carried out. So patients in Glasgow who don't have English as their first language, for example, will have to work out all of this from an automated letter generated in board headquarters. Finally, Presiding Officer, let me turn to the issue of staffing. 2,000 fewer nurses and midwives in the Scottish NHS under the SNP, severe pressure on hospitals such as the Western and Victoria, where patients are waiting in corridors on trolleys for 8 hours at a time. Across Scotland, A&E waiting time targets have not been met since 2009. The Auditor-General tells us the NHS is on amber warning. The RCN says hidden waiting lists should be a wake-up call to Scottish ministers. In their briefing for this debate, the BMA, doctors in our hospitals, the BMA highlight examples of managers shouting at clinical staff and suggest that patients are being inappropriately admitted to hospitals because they would otherwise breach A&E targets. So I hope that the Scottish Government will reflect on this debate and this scandal and decide finally to take some responsibility, end the denials and the defence of their own in favour of working with National Health Service staff to deliver for patients on the promises which they have made to Glaswegians and to people across Scotland. And as a trade unionist, Presiding Officer, can I say finally, I say to the Scottish National Party, stop using the National Health Service staff as a human shield for the political failures of this government.
Thanks very much. Now calling Kevin Stewart, to be followed by Jim Hume. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have heard the Labour Party today again and again call this a scandal, and yet we see them backtracking in what they have said in this chamber in the past few weeks. Because although we know the situation in Lothian, which was acted upon very, very quickly by the government, We heard accusations and inferences in this chamber about same things happening in NHS boards right across the country. NHS Grampian was mentioned in this place only a few weeks ago. And since then, I have been in discussion and communication with NHS Grampian, probably like many members here. And here is what NHS Grampian have to say about certain things that have been thrown their way. Waiting times in Grampian are at their lowest level, and most patients are being seen sooner than ever before. We categorically deny any deliberate tampering with lists. There is no evidence of any kind that Grampian staff manipulated waiting list figures to achieve national targets, nor does the report, the Audit Scotland report, suggest that. We acknowledge that there have been administrative errors which NHS Grampian had identified 2 years ago and which resulted in staff training and the appointment of a new administration manager. No patient was disadvantaged by these errors. Any patient who is unavailable remains on the list and is treated according to clinical priority. These are the facts from NHS Grampian, and yet at the same time, many members of this place peddle rumours that there is a major problem in NHS Grampian, which is quite categorically not the truth. And I would suggest that if anybody has any concerns, that they actually go and talk to those folks in NHS Grampian. Now, one of the things which has been highlighted is social availability codes. In my own area, again, in Grampian, there were cases where sometimes folk were unavailable 4 times during the course of their wait. Now, some folk may question, why 4 times? Why as many as that? Well, the reality is that I come from a part of Scotland where very many people work offshore. And their work, sometimes does not let them go to get treatment at the times that are offered. Now, I have got an example of where this has happened, and I am sure that where there is one example, there are many, many other examples. So I think that actually saying that there may be manipulation of social unavailability codes comes sometimes from folks who maybe don't understand why it is that people would be unavailable at certain points. There has been a lot of talk today about the NHS staff, and I actually resent Drew Smith's last comment about the SNP using staff as a human shield. I would say that I have the highest regard for the staff that work in our NHS, particularly in recent times where quite a number of my family and friends have had to use the services of the NHS in the Grampian area. I have the highest regard. But what you do not get is by slagging off people who, by saying that they are manipulating waiting times, is actually slagging off staff. No, I'm not going to take an intervention from you, Mr Finlay. Sit down. I've got far too much to say in this matter. I think, presiding officer, during the course of these debates, some folk lose sight about how important the NHS is for the people of Scotland. And just thank our lucky stars that we have an SNP government here dealing with the NHS rather than seeing what is going on south of the border. Let's look at what the staff of the NHS have achieved in terms of improving the health of our nation in recent times. We have seen reductions in death from cancer, stroke and coronary heart disease since 2007 by 5%, 24% and 20% respectively. The standardised mortality rate for coronary heart disease has reduced by 43.2% since 2002 and by 41.8% for strokes. The incident rate for coronary heart disease has decreased by 28.9% over the past decade and by 21.7% for stroke. the overall death rate from cancer fell by 12% between 2001 and 2011. These are things to celebrate, I would say. It may well be that not everything is perfect, but I would say that the folks who are working in our National Health Service are doing the best that they possibly can to improve the health of the people of this nation.
Many thanks. I now call on Jim Hume to be followed by Claire Adamson. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I too would like to put on record my admiration for the incredible job our hard-working staff in the National Health Service do day in and day out. Their duties are often carried out in the most trying of circumstances, and I don't think this has ever been truer than over the past few months. While the two issues at hand both relate to NHS waiting times, they are not related and shouldn't be confused. One involves administrative malpractice on the part of some boards, the other woefully inadequate winter contingency planning. However, the common denominator is that both have transpired under this government's stewardship of the National Health Service. The BMA in Scotland produced a briefing ahead of this debate. There was a line within it which reads, "It is important to recognise, however, that waiting times are not the only or the most important indicator of performance." Unquote. This truism, you would hope, would be obvious to the Scottish Government, but recent revelations suggest that somewhere along the line they forgot that. In their obsession to achieve targets, the Scottish Government lost sight of the most important thing, and that is the patient. And just as worrying, they didn't appear to care just how these targets were being met, so long as the numbers looked good at the end of each month. Audit Scotland's report into the waiting times management scandal quite clearly states that, and I quote, "the management and scrutiny of the waiting list systems have not been good enough." Unquote. The Cabinet Secretary cannot surely, in good conscience, try to blame all of this on IT systems. We know in Lothian and Tayside there was a culture of pressure and instances of bullying. Such was the fervour in which management sought to achieve the government's targets. We know that the use of social unavailability codes plummeted remarkably after Lothian was caught red-handed, and we also know that the specialities in the health board areas with the most critical capacity issues deployed such codes more frequently. None of this can be attributed to IT systems, and to suggest so is to insult the intelligence of patients and staff. One of the more frustrating and disappointing elements to this government's handling of the health service has been its spin, the smoke and mirrors it deploys to deflect any kind of negative attention away from it. Patients deserve absolute honesty from the Scottish Government, and they simply are not receiving that. And I would appreciate if the Minister would stay and listen to my speech. When I highlighted the incredible strain being experienced by the A&E units across the country 2 months ago, I was told by the Cabinet Secretary not to paint the kind of picture I am trying to paint. A few more unpalatable headlines later, and we have a £1 million emergency care action plan, short on details and resources, but still apparently not in response to a crisis. And yet more headlines last month. We had the bigger budget sequel, the £50 million unscheduled care action plan referenced in the Scottish Government's ludicrous amendment. On the surface, this sounded a step in the right direction until we discovered that this involved no new money, but a reallocation of funds previously promised elsewhere. And we are yet to hear from the Cabinet Secretary which departments will have to tighten their belts accordingly. Today, we learn from a newspaper, and yet again not from an announcement in this chamber, that the very heat target we are discussing today has been secretly reduced from 98% to 95%. Not only has the Cabinet Secretary moved the goalposts, he'd widened them to make it easier. Cabinet Secretary, you've not even been listening to my speech. You've been out getting a glass of water, and you wouldn't take an intervention from myself. So I'll finish, if you don't mind. He speaks of hidden waiting lists, but what other...
Mr Hume, there's a point of order from the Cabinet Secretary.
Just so that the chamber is not misled, we did not abandon the target. There is still, always has been, a standard of 98%.
Cabinet Secretary,
we've added in a new target of 95%. The member should get his facts right.
Cabinet Secretary, as you know, that is a debating point. Jim Hume, and I will give you the extra time back.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and perhaps the Minister will take that up with the evening news. He speaks of hidden waiting lists, but what other phrase can we use but hidden targets to describe today's revelation? This is rank hypocrisy and yet another example of half-truths, smokes and mirrors. Despite the Cabinet Secretary's reluctance to come clean on the scale of the challenges facing the NHS, the First Minister appeared to signal an admittance of a considerable problem when he described the plan as a serious response to a serious issue. Clearly, the problem is serious. The Government have had to go and slash their waiting time target. I remind members that it was just 3 months ago the Cabinet Secretary was heralding this winter contingency fund, which would ensure that the winter runs smoothly. There is no doubt that targets, where they are clinically appropriate, are a good thing. They were introduced over 10 years ago by Lib Dems in coalition to quicken and improve the patient journey. This has happened, and this is why we will be supporting the Conservative amendment to the Labour Party's motion, which we will also support. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Claire Adamson to be followed by Jenny Mara.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm opening my speech quite uncharacteristically today with a quote from Jim Murphy, but having read the Labour motion, I have no doubt that this is simply a flirtation with surrealism from the Labour Party, because it bears absolutely no relation to the excellent work and the achievements of the NHS across the country. The SNP did abolish Labour and Lib Dems' hidden waiting lists. They're meeting the cancer care target. And as Bob Doris said in his speech, even including social inability figures, we are still achieving a over 90% target for patient treatment. Mr Hume has just mentioned in his speech, which I was listening to very intently, Mr Hume, about how the waiting times are not the only targets in the NHS. And I do agree there are other statistics that we should take cognizance of. Like 10 years ago in 2003, under Labour and the Liberal administration, there were 1,670 patients parked in delayed discharge positions for over 6 weeks. In January 2003, under the SNP, this figure was 57 patients. And this is because the NHS has transformed in the period where the SNP have been in administration, have transformed the way we are delivering, especially for elderly patients. The demographic has huge challenges on the NHS, but I do want to highlight some of the good practice that is happening in this area. When I was a councillor in North Lanarkshire, we had the Living Well project. This was a cross-partnership group encouraging well-being of elderly patients and looking at their quality of life strategy, the commitment to improving their lives, and it brought together the whole community in recognising the pressures of the demographic changes in our society would bring on our services. North Lanarkshire Council were involved, the Voice of Experience Forum, North Lanarkshire Carers Together, Cumbernauld Action, Care for the Elderly, Alzheimer's Scotland and Action on Dementia. North Lanarkshire Council have also been recognised for their good work working with the NHS partners in the re-ablement projects for older people. This is designed to increase confidence, increase capacity, improve mobility, improve health and long-term prospects for elderly patients through intensive work when they present either to social work or to the NHS, and it is actually changing the way that we deal with the patients. I'm really glad also to highlight the intermediate care beds system in North Lanarkshire, which is actually on the Scottish Government website as an example of best practice. This is where North Lanarkshire Council and Lanarkshire have piloted intermediate care beds within 2 care homes, Belhaven, which I'm glad has been saved and not cut, as was at one point presented by North Lanarkshire Council, and Leslie House in Wishaw. The pilot has adapted 2 care homes into developing in Muir Park and Monklands also to provide care centres for respite care and to ensure that elderly patients are not held in hospitals when they've been presenting in A&E, but get the appropriate care and re-enablement procedures given to them. I also, when I was a councillor, did a lot of work with the Scottish Accident Prevention Council, and I know that the pressures in A&E very much come from trips and falls of elderly patients. And ROSPA highlight the problems for a growing population, an ageing population rather. The risk of falling in home increases with age. There is a substantial number of falls are due to unspecified reasons. They are multifactorial, involving both environmental hazards and underlying medical condition. Strength, balance, gait, decline in vision, mental health problems, all can contribute to problems that can lead to presenting at A&E for elderly patients. But ROSPA also tells us that children from postcodes of highly deprived areas are more likely to attend A&E than in other parts of the country. Indeed, mortality rates for boys under 12 are much higher in this demographic. And as someone who lives and represents a region with high pockets of high deprivation, I find it incredulous that a Labour and Liberal Democrat administration would have chosen Monklands A&E to close, and resulting put pressure on Wishaw A&E, both with significant areas of poverty in their respective areas. I'd like to quote from the Cabinet Secretary when she reversed this decision. She said, "Let me be clear," at that time the Cabinet Secretary for Health, "Let me be clear at the outset, it is the Government's view that the decision to close A&E at Monklands and Ayr were wrong and they will now be reversed. We must never forget that the NHS is a public service, a service used by the public, and it is a service paid for by the public. It is the duty of health boards and responsible government to take account of particular local views and circumstances. It is my view, and it is the Government view, that given the particular local circumstances involved in these cases, the geography and demographics, high levels of deprivation and ill health, the real concerns about access to public transport, that A&E services in Ayr and Monklands should be maintained." And I don't think our position has changed. Can I quote some of the figures for actual presentation at A&E in Wishaw and in Monklands? Since 2007, when the SNP reversed that decision, 54,918 patients have attended Monklands A&E. In December of last year, 5,551 patients attended. In Wishaw at the same period, it was 5,207. It beggars belief that their complaints about A&E targets being missed when we consider how much worse that would have been if Labour had been able to close the A&Es
must come to
in those areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jenny Mara, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Presiding Officer, I found the first half of this debate and the SNP's response to Labour's motion this afternoon extremely limited at best, when Labour is using its parliamentary time to try and shine a light on some of the realities that are going on in our NHS. The best that SNP can do is accuse us of flirting with reality and rehearse arguments that were settled 6 years ago. The SNP have had 6 years. It's high time they took some responsibility for the health service and for what's going on. Presiding Officer, as the Royal College of Nurses have said, it can become easy to forget that behind every statistic is a person who needs quality and timely care, and a nurse or healthcare assistant who wants to care for him or her to the best of their ability. And that should never be far from our minds, because this debate is not just about the statistics, it's about how this government is responding to the pressure that our NHS staff are under and the toll that this is taking on patient care, the length and breadth of Scotland. Because in Tayside, Cabinet Secretary, we have 14,000 dedicated NHS workers meeting the needs of over 400,000 people. And it is clear from recent inspections and audits that this challenging task is becoming harder. As a result, corners are cut and standards fall well below what is expected. A December 2012 audit report into NHS Tayside waiting times revealed that over half of staff interviews raised concerns about the environment in which they were expected to perform their duties. Over half. An environment, the report states, where staff felt pressured into entering unavailability they considered to be inappropriate. The report goes on to detail how this resulted in the routine allocation of up to 3 weeks' unavailability in circumstances where questionnaires were issued to patients. Unavailability being added because equipment was not available in hospital, not because unavailability meant unavailable. Yet, just 1 week after this report was published, Alex Neil came to this chamber and said, "Waiting times published by boards are reliable and accurate." In justifying himself, he said more needs to be done to address consistency of recording and quality of information. And he went on to say in a radio interview that it was the computers that were to blame for the problem. We do not accept, in the face of overwhelming evidence and overwhelming reports from the Audit Commission, that this was a problem of computer systems. This was proven by the Auditor-General just the other week. Instead, what is becoming abundantly clear to everybody but the SNP is that our NHS workers are being forced to try and deliver under intense pressure by a government who have ignored the warning signs and continue this afternoon to ignore them and turn a blind eye to them. Certainly.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I just wonder if she's arguing that there should be more resources put into health and taken away from some other sector of the Scottish budget.
Jenny Mara.
Presiding Officer, I am arguing that the SNP need to wake up and smell the coffee and listen to what we are saying, because there is overwhelming evidence from the Auditor-General that these figures are not reliable and that waiting times have been hidden. That is what I am arguing this afternoon, Mr Mason, for clarity. Signs like the August 2010 Audit Scotland report that warned the Government that availability codes were being applied differently in each health board, or the fact that the Auditor-General recently put the NHS on amber warning, or signs like between April 2011 and March 2012, NHS Tayside saw nearly 250,000 hours lost because staff were suffering from stress, anxiety or depression. And with facts like this, it is little wonder that the pressure mounts. This won't be resolved or avoided by a government that seeks to deny that the problem exists or justifies it by trying to tell the nation that it was worse under the previous government. As I said in my opening remarks, Cabinet Secretary, your government has had 6 years. That attitude does nothing to relieve the burden on the staff in NHS Tayside, who feel like they do not have the equipment or the resources that they need to do their jobs. The attitude that it's all fine did nothing to help the patients and staff who were inspected by Healthcare Inspectorate Scotland in Nine Wells in September 2012 and resulted in a report that was never released. And it will do nothing for those who have been marked as socially unavailable for treatments they desperately need. Presiding Officer, we need a government and a health secretary that is not only prepared to accept responsibility when things go wrong, but a government and health secretary responsible enough to reap the advice of experts and their own auditors on how to make things right. And until then, we won't see the real change within the NHS we need to give NHS staff the support they need to give patients the levels of care that they deserve.
Thank you. I now call Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you very much, President Officer. Can I say I agree with Jim Hume? There is more to healthcare than waiting times, but given that this is the subject of debate today, he shouldn't be too surprised that might be why we're focusing on that particular issue. I can also say that I agree with Jackie Baillie right at the outset of her contribution. She said that people don't want their faith in the NHS undermined. I think I've got right in what she said. If I haven't got it absolutely right, and I apologise to her. Let me say I agree with that sentiment totally, but I have to say one of the biggest sources of the undermining of faith in the NHS might be Jackie Baillie coming to this chamber week in, week out to decry what is happening in the NHS as if our National Health Service is broken. And indeed, I hope I've got it correct again, I think she suggested that our NHS was at the point of breaking. I think that is hugely unhelpful and does not reflect reality on the ground. It will be absolutely the case that for individuals from time to time, the NHS, which is, after all, as Mark MacDonald made the point, I think it was Mark MacDonald, as a human institution, as a large institution, will not meet the standards that it should. How could it be anything other than that case when we have an institution of that size? What do I do? What do the rest of us do when we have an individual constituent come to us with a problem about the NHS? Well, I'll tell Jackie Baillie what I do. I try and get on with trying to resolve that problem for that particular individual, try and get that problem resolved for them. I don't come to this chamber to use my constituents' individual particular problem as a form of political knockabout to suggest that the NHS is at the point of breaking. And I have to say, President Officer, Jackie Bale has a temerity to seek an intervention. When I tried to intervene on her and she wouldn't accept one, but lest I bear the brunt of Mr Finlay's wrath, I will of course give way to Ms
Jackie Bailey.
Thank you very much for the member for giving way. Can I say that I take all my constituents' cases up with the Health Board and with the Minister, but they are so disappointed and upset at what's going on in the NHS that they, along with staff, have come to me and agreed that their cases should be used in the chamber to try and get change, to try and make the government wake up to the reality of what's going on in the NHS.
Well,
Jamie Hepburn, and you can have your time
I'm absolutely
back.
delighted. I'm sure her constituents are delighted that she does what the rest of us do. We try and get the problem resolved for a particular constituent. But what I don't do, and what I don't see other members do, is come to this chamber and bring forward that problem as if, and say, and you did say, Ms Bailey, I beg pardon, President Officer, you did not say, Ms Bailey did say that the NHS is at the point of breaking, which I think is very, very unhelpful hyperbole. It does not reflect the reality on the ground. I do not come to this chamber, as Ms Bailey does, and seek to undermine people's faith in the NHS. I can also say to Jenny Mara, she suggests that the Labour Party, of course.
Margaret McDougall. Oh, sorry, Claudia Beamish. Apologies. Apologies. Could I have Claudia Beamish's microphone, please? Ms Beamish, do you have your card in? Claudia Beamish.
Would the member agree with me that it is the role of this chamber, particularly those in opposition, to scrutinise what has happened in public bodies such as the NHS when the issue, such as social unavailability, has not been resolved and a previous Cabinet Secretary has actually hidden behind issues like IT? This is our job, in part.
Jamie Hepburn, I'll give you an extra minute.
I certainly appreciate that, President Officer. I should have known better, because the last time I gave way to the member, she made the same mistake and didn't have her card in the console. Then I'll need to learn better. But yes, of course, I absolutely agree that it is the responsibility of all of us who are on the backbenches, not just opposition members, all of us on the backbenches, to scrutinise what the government are doing. I think we have to do that in a responsible fashion, though, not come to this chamber and suggest that the NHS is at the point of breaking, which I don't think does the NHS or the people we represent a service at all. Can I say to Jenny Mara, she suggested that this was being brought forward to shine a light on what's happening on the ground. Well, that would be all well and good if that was the case, but frankly, the motion before us is a travesty, and it is in several ways, but not least because we do see that the circumstances in terms of waiting times now are far improved from where they once were. And under the previous administration, we had, of course, availability status codes, which essentially allowed people to be put on hidden waiting lists for time immemorial. They would not get any appointment. Were essentially stripped of any guarantee. They should have had little wonder then that 10 years ago there were 6,494 patients waiting longer than 9 months for inpatient treatment, which was a doubling from 1999. As of December 2012, there were 395 patients across Scotland waiting lists waiting longer than 18 weeks. That is a dramatically improved set of circumstances. And we saw at least some recognition from the last administration that the availability status code system wasn't working. Andy Kerr said in 2004, by the end of 2007, we will end the system of availability status codes. It was all well and good saying that, but of course, he did not deliver on that, and it took the election of the SNP to deliver in that regard and institute a system that is immeasurably better in ensuring that people can get seen by the NHS. And I would point out that, because Audit Scotland have been cited several times over the course of the debate, Audit Scotland in 2010 released a report which found they found that the NHS has done well to implement the new arrangements and people no longer remain on waiting lists indefinitely. That was recognition by Audit Scotland that the new system was working far better than the old. And of course, we see that even those with availability status codes are being referred for treatment much quicker. Since 2008, the median wait for treatment in Scotland, including those who have been marked as medically or socially unavailable, reduced from 40 days to 32 days. Presiding Officer, frankly, I think the suggestion that there is some scandal, as is suggested in the motion before us, is in itself a scandal, and we do see that the NHS is in far better hands under this SNP government.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser, to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think I should start with a confession. I'm really rather fond of the Cabinet Secretary for Health. I was fond of him when he was convener of the Enterprise and Culture Committee. I was fond of him when he was the Housing Minister. I was fond of him when he was the Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure. And I'm still rather fond of him. And not just that, Deputy Presiding Officer, I admire his courage. I admired his courage on Friday, when I heard he had gone into the Lion's Den, into an operating theatre, to witness an operation, I believe it was a kidney transplant. Imagine my distress and concern, Deputy Presiding Officer, when I heard he had been taken unwell on that particular occasion. And what was my relief when I found out he had recovered, having been fed simply a glass of water and a chocolate biscuit. If only all those suffering in the NHS could be revived so easily, Presiding Officer, we would at a sweep do away with many of the problems that we currently face. But as well as being fond of the Cabinet Secretary, I've started to feel rather sorry for him. And I've been feeling sorry for him because he has been left picking up the pieces left behind by his predecessor, Nicola Sturgeon, as she has swaned off to her new position as Cabinet Secretary for breaking up Britain. He has been left sorting out the mess in the Scottish Health Service, as week after week we get new revelations about all the terrible things that happened that were covered up by his predecessor, and now all Nicola's skeletons are coming dancing out of the closet. And poor Mr Neil is putting on his bravest face as he tries to force the closet door shut and put them all back in. And talking of Nicola Sturgeon, I'm sorry she's not here to defend herself, Deputy Presiding Officer, but I have to say I would gently remind Jamie Hepburn in relation to the speech he just made and the exchange he had with Jackie Baillie. There are those of us who have been around long enough in this chamber to remember when Nicola Sturgeon was in opposition and is sitting where Jackie Baillie is sitting now, and Nicola Sturgeon was never done raising the cases of individual constituents in the chamber with the then Scottish Government. So perhaps Mr Hepburn should just reflect on that. I'd like to touch on the situation exposed by the recent Audit Scotland report as it affects my own constituents, firstly in Forth Valley. Because what the Audit Scotland report showed was that, whereas NHS Forth Valley had shown good practice with its electronic waiting list system in relation to information recording, there were also noticeable instances of poor practice. And these included access to electronic waiting lists for employees no longer employed at NHS Forth Valley, and the extended use of the incorrect local code, aware of breach, willing to wait, which was eventually dropped in 2012. And Forth Valley had a Scotland high discrepancy in reported and actual waiting times at 35%. Quite serious issues in NHS Forth Valley, and of course not entirely their own fault. After all, they've just seen a headcount reduction in nurse and midwife staff since September 2010 of 97. And as the RCN pointed out in their briefing for this debate, reduced resources will result in mistakes as staff toil under greater pressure and strain, and it does appear to be a national trend. Let me turn to NHS Tayside, which, along with Lothian, were highlighted in the Audit Scotland report as indicators of a failing system. Nearly 25% of NHS Tayside unavailability levels were classed as inappropriate. And let's remember that behind these statistics there are individual patients who are left without care. On the new ways guidance failures at NHS Tayside, the Audit Scotland report states, while some of these appear to be based on misunderstanding, for 17% of 367 transactions tested, unavailability appears to have been systematically applied to prevent patients being reported as not meeting their treatment guarantee date. Now, an NHS Tayside internal investigation found there was no evidence of an intentional manipulation of the waiting time figures. And although the First Minister himself has emphasised the lack of deliberate wrongdoing, it is clear that the current system lent itself to bad practice and errors. Moreover, the complete failure of an adequate whistleblowing system had been noted. I think staff must be allowed to identify errors without fear of reprisal. But as Jackie Baillie said, it's the A&E waiting times that make the worst reading. Now, the First Minister, when questioned on this, blamed the seasonal weather for lower than expected compliance figures. Whatever excuse comes to mind, Deputy Presiding Officer, bad weather, good weather, too much sun, too much rain. Unfortunately, the buck has to stop with his administration. In NHS Forth Valley in December 2007, there was a 98.1% compliance rate, with the A&E target being seen within 4 hours. Last year, in December 2012, that figure was only 85.6%, a very substantial reduction in anyone's standards, bearing in mind the target of 98%. And at NHS Fife, the figure is also down in the same period by nearly 8%. Of course, every statistic hides a person waiting too long to be seen in A&E, often in a very distressed state. And as we had learned today, and as Jackie Baillie pointed out earlier, the Scottish Government have secretly slashed the target and not bothered to tell anyone about it, at least not publicly. Not good enough, Deputy. If I have time, I'll give way. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
To clarify this, the 98% standard that was there is still there. The 95% is a new target which will be achieved from April next month, and therefore the distinction between the standard and the target is what obviously the member doesn't understand, with all due respect.
Murdo Fraser.
Well,
Order, Murdo Fraser, and give you 30 seconds.
I surely cannot be alone in the chamber in having difficulty understanding the distinction between these targets. Perhaps rather than sneaking this out in a newspaper report, the Cabinet Secretary would be better coming to Parliament with a ministerial statement on this issue, where he can explain in great detail to those of us who are slow learners exactly what is the difference between these 2 points, and we can ask suitable questions. Let me just say in closing, Presiding Officer, I am still just an admirer of the Health Secretary, but he really does need to get a grip on the health service in Scotland, or it will take more than a chocolate biscuit to revive his career.
Thank you. John Mason, to be followed by Helen Eadie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I mean, to follow on that point, I must say I greatly admired the Cabinet Secretary for being at an operation I wouldn't even have dared go in, having given blood the first time when I was a student and they had to take me home afterwards. Presiding Officer, I am delighted to speak in today's health debate, and members will not be surprised that I come at this from something of a finance angle. I don't often speak on health, and I am therefore particularly glad to be talking about this today. I think in most debates it's good to be positive if we can be, and I'd like to start with some positive points. I think it is clear that the Scottish Government is continuing to emphasise expenditure on health, and is certainly in the coming year's budget. And we've heard at the Finance Committee, in fact, that some people think it is even too focused on health, and that we could have been putting more resources into other things. But I do congratulate the Government and support them in this emphasis on health and putting the resources there. Secondly, waiting time figures are very positive. We've heard a lot of figures this afternoon, but when we compare to the past, for example, 10 years ago, 6,494 were waiting longer than 9 months. December 2012, only 395 waiting longer than 18 weeks. Well, that sounds like improvement to me. And third, patient satisfaction has to be a key in all services, including health services. Another indicator, 88% of patients satisfied or very satisfied. However, there is always going to be room for improvement, and I think that everybody accepts that. Nicola Sturgeon has accepted that, Alec Neil has accepted that, Alex Salmond have accepted that. Of course, there is always room for improvement. To look at the Labour motion now, I have to say I think some of the wording is quite poor and perhaps even contradictory. And one or two have mentioned some of the words there already, but I'd like to look at a couple. One of the phrases they use is putting patients and hard-working staff first. Well, presumably that's what targets are intended to do, is to put patients first and to ensure that they get the very best treatment they can. And I just wonder what exactly Labour is suggesting it should be done to put them first, because I've listened now to a number of debates today. We've heard a lot of description about problems and many individual cases, but we have not heard very much about what Labour would do to put that right. or to improve the situation, for example, putting in more resources. And if they're intending to put patients and staff first, does that mean that education and schools are going to be put down the list and put second and given less resources? Because if that is the case, I would not be comfortable with that. Of course, in one sense, targets put pressure on staff to deliver for patients. I just wonder if Labour are suggesting that there should be less pressure on staff, even though the patients would suffer because of that. And again, I would have major problems with that. Another phrase right at the end of the Labour motion is best possible patient care. And I just wonder what that means. The best in the world for every single problem, no matter what the cost is, that is surely impossible. All our services have to live within their budgets, and we want to do the best possible care we can within the budget, and I would certainly agree with that. But if the request is for more funding for health, then we have to be told where that funding is to come from. Jackie Baillie said we need more nurses, and therefore where would she take that away? From teachers or from colleges? And Jenny Mara, when I intervened, refused to answer my question as to whether she wanted more resources for health or not. Now, this happened during the budget process again and again. Many departments, many committees coming to the Finance Committee and the Cabinet Secretary saying we want more resources for our little part of the world, all of which are important, but they would not tell us where they thought that money should come from. Absolutely.
Jackie Baillie.
Thank John Mason for taking the intervention. I think I'm on record numerous occasions in saying that we would reorganise the 22 health boards that currently are part of the institutional cluster in Scotland, and that would release tens of millions of pounds that could actually lead to more nurses being employed.
John Mason.
Yes, well, that's interesting because that would mean a very, very centralised system, and that was one of the things I'll come on to, so I'll just touch on it just now, because I think that is something also that I would be very wary of. Clearly, I think we should be wary of making all sorts of comparisons. I think we make too many comparisons with our nearest neighbour England, too many with the United States and others. But, for example, comparisons between health boards. If we believe in pushing decision-making down to the local level, then there needs to be acceptance that there will be differences in the local provision. Now, the word lottery gets used, and that is a wrong use of the word, because lottery suggests chance, whereas actually what we're talking about is local decision-making. And, for example, in Glasgow, we do not have exactly the same problems as they have in Edinburgh or in Aberdeen, and I do not want the health decisions for Glasgow made in Edinburgh or Aberdeen, quite frankly, if that is what she is suggesting. Now, while the NHS is there to serve patients, which is potentially all of us, I think we have to be realistic too about what we expect from staff. Of course, figures should not be fiddled, no matter what, and staff should be able to challenge colleagues if fiddling is suggested or actually happening, as I think Murdo Fraser was suggesting. Finally, I would just like to say how committed I am, and I believe our party is, to keeping health in the public sector. Yesterday we debated demographic change, and we had one Labour member suggesting that those who can afford to pay should pay. Well, I do not find it acceptable that people turn up at A&E or go to their GP and be asked for a credit card or to be means tested. As far as I am concerned, we are committed to the NHS being free at the point of delivery. Presiding Officer, this is a dividing line between this party and Labour. They are willing to roll back the NHS. We will fight for the National Health Service. We may not always be successful in that fight. We won't always be able to afford all we want to do, but we will fight for the NHS.
Thank you. Helen Needy, to be followed by Gill Patterson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Now, Alex Neil said at the very outset that the Labour Party does not have respect for the honesty and integrity of doctors and nurses in the NHS. Now, I have total disrespect for that comment, Cabinet Secretary, because this is a total anathema of the Labour Party to think about not having absolute respect for every worker in the NHS. Now, I have to say that it's something that the Labour Party has fought tooth and nail through decades and generations to have the improvements to the NHS, and it's something that I am sure, I am certain, the Labour Party will continue to do. And the very fact that we scrutinise the work, quite rightly, of the Scottish Government, then I really think that backbenchers in the SNP, Jamie Hepburn and others who are not here in the debate just now, need to just reflect on that fact. We are doing the job we were sent here by the people of Scotland to do. And I think that, contrary to what Jamie Hepburn says,
Ms Eady, point of order. Point of order, Jackson
I'm having difficulty hearing Miss Eady, and I wonder if she might turn her microphone round just so that it's pointing towards her.
Thank you, Mr Carlow. I was waiting for a suitable moment to ask Mrs Eady to do that.
Sorry, it's not usual that people complain of not hearing me. I mean, but thank you, Jackson. I think that Jamie Hepburn has criticised our front bench team in the shape of Jackie Baillie. Well, I have to say that I, and I know other members of my Labour group and members in the wider party and people right across Scotland have got every reason to be indebted to Jackie Baillie and to Richard Simpson and to Drew Smith for the absolute forensic work that they are doing on behalf of the Labour Party in scrutinising what's happening by the Scottish Government, and the fact that we have brought a really important topic to the debate today. And I have to say, I very much agree with Nanette Milne when she says she is not interested, and neither is Jackson Carlow, and who did something 10 years ago. 10 years on means that everyone should have learned progress. Progress has to be demonstrable, and the SNP needs to ask itself, is it happy with no progress at all? They need to take responsibility for the choices. They chose not to be responsible for winter, and they chose not to be responsible for the cut beds and nurses and making the NHS do more and more with less and less. Since the SNP came to power, it is a fact that the number of patients seen within the 4-hour waiting time target fell to 90.3% in December 2012, the lowest ever recorded since the target was introduced in December 2007. During December 2012, the number of people that spent more than 12 hours in A&E was the highest on record. 323 people. 323 people with their families caring for them and for all who were around them. The Scottish Government's own statistics said this week that the last time compliance was met across Scotland was September 2009. Alex Neil said Labour would have closed A&E at Monklands. Well, Cabinet Secretary, I can tell you the SNP did close the accident emergency at Queen Margaret Hospital, and if you ever have a by-election in the west of Fife, you better get the first thing opened is the accident emergency at the Queen Margaret Hospital, because that was on your watch, and Nicola Sturgeon refused to unpick that decision taken by the NHS Fife Health Board.
Through the Chair, please, Mrs Eady. Thanks.
The real world is very much something that we are concerned with today. And I need to say to Jamie Hepburn again, who's not in the chamber, and to John Mason and to others, that Patients Action Scotland is running a crisis conference this weekend. The reality is that there are far too many constituents not getting the support that the NHS should provide. That's the real world. That's the world that the Patients Action Scotland is going to be articulating this weekend, as well as the BMA, as well as the Royal College of Nursing, all the people who have written to us for the briefing for today. They are the people who need to be listened to, because if you don't listen, you do so at your peril. The former Health Secretary, Nicola Sturgeon, must explain to Holyrood what she knew about the NHS-Waiting-Times scandal before it was exposed. It followed a recent report from the Audit Scotland, which scrutinised NHS Board's management waiting lists, and the Audit Scotland report made clear that Nicola Sturgeon should have known about the hidden waiting lists over which she presided. She should have asked questions about the misuse of social unavailability, but either didn't or failed to act when told what was happening. Nicola Sturgeon needs to come to Parliament and explain what she knew, when she knew it, and why she failed to act on the warnings. She sat through the ministerial statement on the Audit Scotland report, but didn't speak at all. Now she needs to answer for her inaction. Or if she can't, then Alex Neil owes it to patients across Scotland to speak for her and be clear about that information. Locally, NHS 5 had the third highest number of patients across Scotland waiting over 12 hours in December. Throughout the final month of last year, 65 patients had to wait over 12 hours in accident and emergency, and I have an average of over 2 per day. only NHS Lothian with 78 patients and NHS Lanarkshire with 117 patients posted worst results. NHS Fife failing to meet their accident and emergency waiting time target follows on from missing their cancer waiting time target, a fall in the number of hospital beds available and a rise in hospital complaints. And I can see, Presiding Officer, I've run out of time, but I do believe that the Scottish Government's failure to address the underlying problems in our NHS is resulting in the people of Fife and Scotland in having to pay the price when it comes to accident and emergency waiting times. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And I now call Gill Patterson.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. As a member of the Health and Sports Committee, I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate today. The issue of waiting times for treatment through the National Health Service is one that affects many of my constituents and the members of this Parliament. And as Jamie Hepburn and John Mason highlighted, in 2003 there were 6,494 patients who were waiting longer than 9 months for inpatient treatment. Progress has certainly been made since then, with only 395 patients across Scotland being on waiting lists for longer than 18 weeks. There's still a lot of work to be done, and I recognise the Scottish Government's commitment to bringing down these figures even more. It's also worth repeating, when the Labour Party was in power prior to the 2007 Scottish parliamentary elections, there was the threat of closure hanging over a number of hospitals. Accident and emergency departments at Monklands and Ayr hospitals were targeted by the Labour administration, and one must ponder what would have happened to waiting times and the general patient care if the Labour Party had been elected to government. Fortunately for the local population, many of whom had campaigned to protect these services, the SNP were elected to government and kept their promise to prevent them from closing, which had the potential of being catastrophic to the local health care provision. Added to this is a hospital that some of my constituents relied on, the Vale of Leven Hospital, suffered the salami slicing under Labour of its services in a bid to run down the facility and open the way to closure. Again, the SNP government stepped up and reversed proposals to close that hospital, providing some comfort to the local people. And since July 2007, a total of 82,386 patients have attended the Vale of Leven Hospital, which would raise concerns, just in a moment, which would raise concerns over where they would have went if the hospital had been closed under Labour. Jackie Baillie.
Jackie Baillie.
Can I thank the member for the intervention? Would you care to comment on the fact that under the SNP's watch, maternity services have been slashed from a 24/7 service to literally an 8 to 8 service? Lab services have been taken away from the Vale of Leven Hospital and centralised at the RAH. And despite a commitment to keep services local, the SNP closed the Christie ward at the Vale Hospital.
Gill Patterson.
Well, the Christie ward members actually burnt down. That's another story. But I noticed you didn't actually come to the rescue of your Labour government at the time, Jackie. You know as well as I know that you put more paint on your nails than went on the wall of the Vale of Leven Hospital in 10 years.
Through the chair, please, Mr Patterson.
Pardon?
Through the chair, please.
Sorry, Presiding Officer. OK, nice nails. The Labour Party would certainly do well to remember their own actions in dealing with waiting lists before lecturing others. The shame of their hidden waiting lists through the availability status quos, which effectively strip patients of their guarantee for treatment, will long be remembered by those affected by that system. The SNP government again stepped up to challenge and introduce a system that had the best interests of the patient at heart. The new waste system was designed to be more transparent than the failed Labour Party system, and that's why the statistics are available to this Parliament and can be audited. Presiding Officers, when we look across the border to our neighbours in England and you see how the UK Government is intent of dismantling the National Health Service, I am pleased that this Scottish Government has a different approach. I am pleased that the Government is committed to the founding principles of the NHS, with its continuing to be a universal public health service. Care for the patients is the highest priority for the Government, and this can be seen by the decision not to cut the health budget, despite the overall cut to the Scottish budget by Labour's Better Together partners. But without the support and dedication of the hard-working NHS staff, patient care would suffer, and for that they should be commended. Our NHS staff deliver a top-class service to patients and to families, and I am concerned that the morale of the staff might be damaged with the constant negative scare stories that emanate from the Labour benches. Continued public confidence in our NHS must be of the highest priority. When the public begin to mistrust doctors and nurses, then we are in a very serious situation. That's why I welcome the Audit Scotland's findings that after an extensive investigation, there was no evidence of deliberate manipulation of waiting times. Further to this, I am pleased that 91% of the 105 internal audit recommendations have already been enacted. The health service faces a large number of challenges over the next few years. The UK Government's welfare reforms will have a negative impact on the health of the people in this country, with many requiring assistance. That's why this Scottish Government has protected the NHS budget, and that there will be a real terms increase in the frontline HNS budget over the next 3 years. The Labour Party's refused to ring-fence the health budget. Just one reason why they failed in 2011.
To conclude.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. I would just say that I recommend to the Chamber that they support the amendment in the name of Alec Neil, the Cabinet Secretary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We now turn to closing speeches. Can I say to the Chamber that if members are in the Chamber, they might want to consider putting their cards in their slots in case they feel compelled to intervene on anyone in the Chamber. I call on Jackson Carlaw. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. This is an afternoon when it's been a great shame there has only been water to drink. Once upon a time, there was a Scottish coalition government who were elected to administration in a devolved Scotland, and they were entrusted with care of Scotland's NHS. From out of the mists of the moor came a wicked woman who harangued them about waiting times. And it came to pass that the said wicked woman was elected to take charge of the NHS herself, and her former coalition partners decided that revenge was a dish best tasted cold, and they would harangue her just as she had harangued them. This is a pantomime, and a pantomime, frankly, is largely what we have witnessed in the Chamber this afternoon. I think we're past the point where we can pretend there's nothing wrong in Scotland's NHS. The Audit Scotland report, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary saying that there would be an earlier review of waiting times than before, did highlight problems. We know that there are A&E targets that are being missed, and we are in denial if we pretend that is not the case. We know that the A&E performance in December was the worst for 6 years. We know that nursing vacancies are at a 6-year high. We know that bed-blocking targets are due to be missed. We know that the weather, holidays and IT systems are not an explanation for all of this. So some of what the Labour Party have said in their motion this afternoon, the criticism, is due and it is in part fair. But I'd like to put the voice of a nurse at the heart of this afternoon's debate. This is a nurse I know personally, who lost a relative in the most shocking of circumstances as a teenager and who pursued a career in nursing as a result. She posted this in an online forum on the BBC. "I don't believe anyone has the right to pass comment on a nurse's job without having done it. After years of constant stress from abominable staffing levels, constant verbal and physical abuse, lack of support from hospital management, lack of support from the public, not all thankfully, ridiculous expectations from many and countless hours of my own time spent for caring for others, with nothing but scorn from those who feel I have not done my job properly, I have now spoken with my feet and left the profession that I worked so hard to enter. People complain constantly about the terrible care they receive, but at the end of the day, we are only human. What you see is not the full story. Relatives and patients see only their own circumstance. A nurse juggles, you and many others, all wishing her attention right there and then. I believe I was very good at my job and cared for my patients to the highest standards that were possible. But at the end of the day, I had to manage my time. A wet bed, a turn due, a dressing needs changed, a patient needs the toilet, a patient needs fed, someone wants paracetamol, someone is about to pass away, someone has fallen and there's a really sick patient needing transfer to HDU and a handover needs to be given. This patient needs constant monitoring, IVs, documentation and general care. A relative has been waiting to speak for me for 10 minutes, is now getting annoyed. There's another relative on the phone and 4 more wanting my attention before the end of visiting. I've spoken to most of them on the phone already today while trying to look after others. An emergency buzzer, a lady wanting into bed, drugs needing made up and given, notes needing written up, bed managers wanting beds cleared, and A&E wanting to give handovers of more patients needing into the ward. There's a patient shouting and swearing at me because he wants out for a cigarette and it's not safe for him to leave because of the treatment he has had. So someone needs to stay with him. Someone else is unhappy because they haven't had all their drugs. They do not understand this is for medical reasons. I need time to explain this to them, but there's hardly any staff. So what comes first? What should be the priority? Yes, patients suffer and receive standards that are below those expected by the public, but the care most nurses give is the highest standard they can physically manage. People have no idea of the stress our profession brings. I studied 4 years for a BSc Honours degree and continue to train and develop throughout my career. However, this job is changing, not because nurses care less, but because the demands get greater every day while staff numbers decline. I have decided enough is enough. I no longer want to suffer the constant stress and abuse that nursing brings. I deeply respect all my friends and every other person still struggling on in nursing. The public should hope and pray that they can withstand the constant negativity and abuse, as without them many lives would be much worse and many people would not live to see another day. Every profession has good and bad, but no one comes into nursing for the pay or as an easy option. If they did, they wouldn't last long. I believe many, although not all, of the so-called bad nurses are ground-bound by the job and are just the perception of a bystander who knows little of what they are dealing with. That's the testimony of a nurse today. It's not a criticism of any one administration. We know that there are avoidable conditions that we are failing to tackle. We know that the preventative care agenda is not turning the tide as we need it to do. And I do complain, and did at the time, about the previous Cabinet Secretary's abandoning of the health visiting strategy in Scotland. What should the NHS do? Perhaps we need a radical review, maybe a radical review of the procedures and processes in the NHS, every bit as severe and investigative as the SMC review that goes into new medicines. We are 6.5 years at the midway point of this government, so the criticism by the Labour Party may be fair. But I've got to say, I look across the chamber this afternoon and I do not hear a convincing strategy deserving of government from the other side of the chamber. That case is yet to be made. And the Labour attendance in this debate dropped to 9 members at one point on the issue that they think, above all else, is the defining one by which we should be judging this administration. You know, I don't hold a candle for the NHS in England. It's not my duty to do so. Our duty as politicians is to the NHS here in Scotland, to the patients here who need it, to the public here who cherish it, to the staff here who sustain it. What they are looking for, Cabinet Secretary, is leadership. Leadership from you, and that is an acknowledgement that some of what your predecessor did was not a success, however well-intentioned it may have been. They are looking for leadership. They are giving you an opportunity to provide it. If you will provide that solution for the NHS, we will work with you. But we cannot pretend there is not a problem, and we cannot pretend that we can go on as we are.
Thank you. I now call on Michael Matheson. Maximum 8 minutes, Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I, like everyone else in this chamber, recognise that we all have a shared interest in trying to make sure that our NHS in Scotland is the best possible health service that can be provided to the public in Scotland. I have no doubt that many members of this chamber have made personal use of it, or their family members have made use of it, and we all wish to see a service that is the best possible service that patients can receive. But we have always recognised that the service does not always get it right. I sought personally not get it right for members of my family. I speak to constituents where the NHS does not get it right for them. But I also witness and I also speak to constituents and members of my family where the NHS does get it right for them, time in, time out because of the hard work and dedication of the staff within our NHS. And I recognise that when the NHS gets it wrong, and where there is clear evidence that the NHS is getting it wrong, that we as a government have a responsibility to take action to address those errors and to make sure that we improve upon those errors where they occur. And that has always been the case with this government, recognising the need to make sure that we continue to build on the improvements that have been made and to make sure that we continue to improve the service overall. But where I do disagree with some members is that there are times when assertion is presented as fact when it comes to issues around our NHS, where there is a lack of evidence around those so-called criticisms that come up time and time again. And no matter how often people like Jackie Baillie choose to make these assertions, you can make it over and over again in certain issues, that doesn't mean that automatically becomes a fact. But where there are clear facts that there are errors, that's where we can take action to address these issues. But just like when Jackie Baillie makes the assertion that there are less staff in our NHS now than what we inherited, well, the facts are that is not the case. There are more staff in our NHS now than there was when we inherited it. But also, to put this in context, there are more qualified nurses and midwives per 1,000 in the population in Scotland than the rest of the UK, with 7.9 nurses and midwives compared to 5.8 in England, 7.1 in Wales and 7.8 in Northern Ireland. So we do have a significant number of staff within our NHS compared to other areas of the NHS in the UK. And just like when Jackie Baillie said here this afternoon that there is inadequate amounts of staff within our accident emergency department, it is worth keeping in mind that under this government there has been a 92.7% increase in the number of accident emergency consultants we now have in Scotland. But what I recognise is that despite these improvements that we have made, there continue to be significant challenges. Challenges in our accident emergency departments in order to make sure they treat patients as quickly as possible and move them on to the next place where their care can actually be provided. And we need to take the type of concerted action that's necessary in order to address these challenges. That's why the Scottish Government has brought forward its programme for unscheduled care, in order to make sure that we actually plan for these issues more effectively and that we get the move from community into the front end of the hospital, into the other departments within the hospital, much more effectively than it is in some areas at the present moment. I thought Mark MacDonald made an important point in his contribution, because at times in the scramble to have a go at the Scottish Government and the NHS, very often we can forget the progress that has been made in a number of areas. The significant progress in the way in which we treat people with cardiovascular disease, the significant progress that's been made in how we treat people who have suffered a stroke, the improvements in cancer treatment in Scotland. But yes, there is certainly more we can do to prevent ill health that is avoidable, which can reduce the pressure that our NHS faces as well. But one of the other very significant areas of progress that has been made over recent years has been the reduction in hospital-acquired infections within our NHS. As at January the 9th this year, the number of cases of C. diff in patients over 65 has decreased by 79.2% compared to the same figure in 2007. That's not 7.9%, that's 79.2% of a reduction. A massive improvement as a result of the dedication and work of our NHS staff. On MRSA, there were 33 cases in the last quarter of July to September 2012. This is a decrease of 86% compared to the same period in 2007. Not 8.6%, 86.7% of a reduction. Again, a reflection of the progress that's been made by our staff, and an increase in the budget in this area from £15 million to £50 million in order to continue these improvements. But one of the areas that I think our NHS has made very significant improvements in has been as a result of the patient safety programme that's been introduced. The patient safety programme was launched in January 2008 with a 5-year programme. It focuses on acute sector and with a key objective of reducing healthcare-acquired infection, adverse surgical incidents, adverse drug events, and improving critical care outcomes and organisational leadership and safety culture within the organisation. Its primary aim was to reduce mortality by 20% by 2015. Now, this is a programme that has reaped significant benefits for our NHS in Scotland. That's not just my view, that's the international view of what's happened in our NHS in Scotland. Don Berwick, the person who has been brought in by the Prime Minister to help to repair the damage being caused off the back of the Mid-Staffs report, has stated, and I quote, "The Scottish Patient Safety Programme is without doubt one of the most ambitious patient safety initiatives in the world, national in scale, bold in aims and disciplined in science, aligned towards a common vision, making Scotland the safest nation on earth from the viewpoint of healthcare." That's a view that's been recognised internationally, with Sweden, Norway, Denmark all now looking at our patient safety programme and looking at adapting it. And it's not only within our acute setting we've got it. We've moved it now into mental health. Tomorrow I will launch it moving into our maternity care services, and next week the Cabinet Secretary will launch its moving into our primary care service. These are significant improvements which have occurred as a result of the changes that have occurred over the last 6 years. But I also recognise, Presiding Officer, that there are still areas where we can make further improvements. But as the Auditor-General said in her evidence to the committee last week, when it came to the whole issue of waiting times, we have not found evidence of manipulation at all. That doesn't mean that the Audit Scotland report did not highlight issues of inconsistency, where there could be further improvements made, and that's why we've accepted every single one of their recommendations, with almost three-quarters of them already being implemented, in order to make sure that we address the areas where further improvements can be made. This Government is committed to building on the improvements that we've made over the last 6 years in our NHS in Scotland, and this Chamber can be confident that the Cabinet Secretary and myself will continue to make sure we build on that progress in the years to come.
Thank you, Minister. I now call on Dr Richard Simpson to wind up 10 minutes. Please, Dr Simpson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by saying that no matter how often the SNP repeat it, the statement that we were not committed to passing on health consequentials is just wrong. Labour, in our 2011 manifesto, committed to pass on all consequentials. It's in the manifesto. Now, let us also begin by acknowledging that with the doubling of funding for the NHS and the extremely hard work of the staff, significant progress has indeed been made continuously over the past 15 years. We began when people were waiting for 2 years. We reduced it to 6 months. And we acknowledge there has been further progress since. There is no doubt about that. But that is not what the debate is about today. The debate is about promises that were made to correct a system that the Parliament agreed was wrong in 2005-06, that is the Availability Status Codes, and replace it by a better system in which the public could have trust. So let us look at the history. Let us start with 2007. Because, as the RCN said in their briefing, the waiting times management systems should have been about supporting timely, equitable and transparent access to our healthcare system. Nicola Sturgeon, in her statement in September 2007, said, "The new system will be subject to full scrutiny. First, hospitals will be obliged to advise patients when their waiting time clock has been stopped." She went on to say, "I have asked for measures to be put in place to ensure that NHS boards operate the new arrangements fairly, consistently and in the interests of patients. And the NSS Information Services Division will undertake cross-checks on samples of patients, and the aim will be to ensure that details are accurate and that recorded periods of unavailability are supported by evidence." Now, that was the promise that the Cabinet Secretary made to us in 2007. So where are all these checks and balances? Roll forward to 2009, 1 year after the new system came into being, and I asked a question, which I've done repeatedly throughout my period as Shadow Minister, and that is, when something changes or there is variation, I believe it is the responsibility of ministers and shadow ministers to ask questions and ask for an explanation. So the question I put at that point was she sure that the 100,000 patients annually that were now being put off the list were justified? Were they all justified? Because the first year of operation it had only been 60,000. The Audit Scotland report of 2013 has that figure now at 339,000 for 9 months, an annual figure of 440,000. That figure has multiplied immensely. It hasn't been raised today, but it is another issue I would suggest to the Cabinet Secretary he needs to look at, because these are real people and real patients who are being put off the list. Now, if that's not a hidden list, what is? If they're all do not arrive, if they're all cancel their appointments, that's absolutely fine. But we cannot tell from the recording systems what is actually happening. Roll forward again, March 2010, and Audit Scotland produces a report saying, yes, we're making quite good progress. The system seems to be quite good. Indeed, UKSA said, yes, it looks like a good system. I accept that. But the Audit Scotland also said that there were some warning signs and that these needed to be addressed, and they gave a series of specific requests to the government which Nicola Sturgeon, as Cabinet Secretary, ignored. And when they were asked in 2011, in April, whether the action was being taken, what did they say? The SNP said an imminent revision of the system will be brought into place. It didn't happen until the scandal was exposed of Lothian, until we got through the next Audit Scotland report. Then there was action. So they gave false reassurance to Audit Scotland. Now, in 2013, what do we now know? We now know that we have a massively dysfunctional system. There was manipulation proved in Lothian, but in many health boards there was simply no way that the data could be tracked. Tellingly, however, as soon as the Lothian scandal was revealed, the social unavailability levels, which had reached 30% from a figure of 10 or 11% in 2009, suddenly began to drop. And not one SNP member in the debate today has given us anything of an explanation for why that's occurred. Oh, but we were offered explanations. The first one was from Nicola Sturgeon to me when I asked about it before the Audit Scotland report. And the explanation was, well, the waiting times have become shorter, so people are getting less notice, so they're asking for social unavailability more. 3 times as many? And 900 patients, 70% in an orthopaedic department asking for social unavailability? My God, the whole of Glasgow seemed to be on holiday. This is not a consistent system. This is not the transparent system. This is not the full scrutiny. This is not the system which protects patients, which Ms Sturgeon promised the Parliament and the public. Yet we have a Cabinet Secretary on May the 20th saying we have a transparent system, and then saying we weren't told it was the ISD's fault. But we have a statement from the ISD spokesman saying, regarding our reporting to Scottish Government, social unavailability would have been one item in the extensively quarterly reporting of waiting time statistics. In one particular system, we were told that it was the IT system that was at fault, but the Auditor-General made clear to Jackie Bailey at the Public Accounts Committee most systems that are currently available have a facility to record the reason for applying social unavailability code to a patient and demonstrating that it is a result of a conversation with a patient or GP, and in most places this was not used. So Labour has now been joined by Audit Scotland, the RCN and the BMA, and most importantly patients and families, in saying there is a real problem with our waiting list system, and unless you admit that, Cabinet Secretary, we can't move forward. It is of particular concern to the BMA that the use of social unavailability codes was so widespread and were used so inappropriately. So, is now all well? Because we're being told it is. No, not quite, because there are reports of bullying. The pressures are not necessarily isolated to Lothian, said BMA. And in a survey accompanying the 2010 audit, I'm sorry, I don't have time because I have a lot to get through. I do apologise to Alex Neil. That more than half the doctors and nurses believed that patients were sometimes inappropriately admitted to hospital to avoid breaching the 4-hour waiting times. and feedback from the BMA members suggested that the aggressive management style is not isolated to Lothian, a point we made and has been rejected repeatedly. The BMA are saying that, not us. It's more than 2 years since I called for the introduction of a whistleblowers line, and it won't come until next month. Are there any other problems? Well, the Audit Scotland reported also that almost 500,000, in fact slightly more than an annualised figure, 520,000 patients were offered an appointment at 3 days' notice. Is that a reasonable offer under the new system? And is the new system of 7 days reasonable? It used to be 21 days. And we have inconsistently, as many members have pointed out. Accident and emergency is clearly a problem. In 2005, the drive to a 4-hour target was announced. It was achieved in 2009, but not since then. That's a reality, even if the figures are not being recorded quite correctly. But more worryingly, 323 people were in A&E for more than 12 hours, as Helen Eadie said, the highest cut since the target came in. Trolley waits are again becoming a norm, with graphic pictures like that of 84-year-old John McGarity. And as Jenny Mara said, a hidden report from the inspectors observing patients on trolley in Tayside, the inspectors are rubbished, instead of acknowledging the pressures and the effects on staff. So this is not a new situation, as Jim Hume reminded us, and the money that is now offered to solve the problem is also not new. And we have a lower target of 95,000 sneaked out, again not announced to the Parliament. Oh, but it's a target, not a standard. And I have to say to Murdo Fraser, he was not alone in his absolute incomprehension of what the hell the difference is between those two, forgive my words. Finally, I want to finish by referring to, in the last 40 seconds,
wasn't appropriate.
I said I apologise.
Okay, sorry. Right.
Finally, the area for me which is of considerable concern is cancer. In December, I asked the First Minister about the 600 Scots for whom the target had been missed, 200 in colorectal cancer. I was offered an explanation from the Cabinet Secretary in due course. I am still waiting. But why am I concerned? Because although we've got a target, and although the Health Service is doing phenomenally well with that target, those who wait are waiting a median time of a further 61 days, double the target. It is not being dealt with properly. I'll conclude, Presiding Officer, by saying all we ask this government to do is to look at these things carefully and come up with a system which works and be honest about it, and to take a deep dive on those patients who have been misled by waiting time figures which are inappropriate in order that Scotland have said that they are. That is what should happen, and that is, as Jackson Carlo said, where the debate should now move to.
That concludes the debate on NHS waiting times. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 5820 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. I would ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now. And I call on just in time Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5820.
Formally moved.
Thank you. No members asked to speak against the motion. Therefore, I will now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5820 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 5821 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a revision to the business programme for Thursday 7th of March 2013. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion 5821.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion. I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5821 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 5822 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a Stage 2 timetable for the Aquaculture and Fisheries Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now. And I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5822.
Formally moved.
No member is asked to speak against the motion. I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 5822 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion. I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 5846 on referral from SSI to the Parliament. The question on this motion will be put at decision time. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. Can I remind members that in relation to the debate on NHS waiting times, if the amendment in the name of Alex Neil is agreed, the amendment in the name of Nanette Milne falls. The first question is amendment number 5813.2 in the name of Alex Neil, which seeks to amend motion number 5813 in the name of Jackie Baillie on NHS waiting times be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 5813.2 in the name of Alex Neil is as follows. Yes, 64. No, 52. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to, and that means that the amendment in the name of Nanette Milne falls. The next question is that motion number 5813 in the name of Jackie Baillie as amended on NHS waiting times be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to a vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 5813 in the name of Jackie Baillie as amended is as follows. Yes, 64. No, 52. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 5846 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on referral of an SSI be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should now do so quickly and quietly.